Well, yeah, thank you all for coming. This is a presentation for the subset of theoretical practice on the work of José Arthur Giannotti. Not only, I mean, this is situated within a broader research. I hope to make it somewhat clearer in the presentation itself. And also to keep it a bit short, as we've been discussing, perhaps to stay within the limit of 1 hour. And then if anybody has a question, like a quick question, can ask me right away, it's okay. But perhaps to have a more detailed debate afterwards might be cool. So let me share my screen. No, not the PowerPoint. I want the, yeah, what's going on? Just a sec. Oh, is this issue with the screen sharing here? No. I'll just share the PowerPoint then. It's easier. I usually prefer to share the PDF version. Hey, so I named this Giannotti on the operational scheme because I intend to just, I mean, the book itself, I mean, Giannotti has a big kind of oeuvre, but I was going to perhaps concentrate on, firstly, I wanted to concentrate on 2 books, which are Trabalho, Reflexão, and Apresentação do Mundo, Labor and Reflection and Presentation of the World. But then I thought this was way too much for a presentation. And then I decided to concentrate on Trabalho e Reflexão. Then that was way too much for a presentation. So I ended up paring it down to the first chapter of Trabalho e Reflexão and some comments on the general project and a little bit of the passage to Apresentação do Mundo. You understand what's the point of this, because there's a kind of a big shift there. Up until Trabalho e Reflexão, Giannotti is a Marxologist or Marxist or whatever you want to call him, but he's involved in the study of Marx, heavily involved. Like he had a huge influence here in Brazil as an initiator of the Seminários Marx in the 60s in the University of São Paulo. But then after the 80s, he started writing this Wittgenstein book, which is called Apresentação do Mundo. Of course, people that were into Marx were kind of locked down by that. I think the book is great, but anyway, I'm also coming from a Wittgenstein and kind of persuasion, so that's a different take that I have on this. And yeah, so I wanted to examine this passage and under the light of a certain comment that Paulo Arantes, another hero of ours, I mean, Giannotti is only a hero of myself, not of anybody else here, I think, but Paulo Arantes is more, it's more, I think, more communized. And Paulo Arantes was actually Giannotti's student, which is kind of a relevant piece of information here. So, yeah, this is the basic, how do you say, like recorte, like the definition of what was the subject of today's presentation. I wanted to give a little bit of context of why this is interesting to me, particularly, and how does this connect to the project of the STP, and perhaps specifically coming from a certain section of the Atlas of Experimental Politics, section 12, the one that I wrote about Zonhettel and Sellers, right? I was going to talk about the critique of the given, but I already did this several times here, and it's kind of a complex issue, so I didn't want to really lose too much time on that. So I'm diving directly in Zonhettel. The thing with the Zonhettel is what I call the 2 Zonhettelian theses. People usually say that Zonhettel has only one thesis, like the idea that abstraction comes from exchange, like social practice, and the minds of the ones that are exchanging are not directly involved in the emergence of the abstraction. They are occupied with use values when they exchange commodities. And because they are exchanging commodities, some kind of substance emerges, like something that is akin to a philosophical substance, like some sort of homogeneity emerges. That is the real abstraction of value that emerges for Zonhetl with an exchange, right? Which is a kind of a point of disagreement between Zonhetl and several other value form theorists. But anyway, this is the Zonhetelian take on that. So this real abstraction performs a form of social synthesis. This is kind of, I'd say, the first thesis. And the second thesis would be something much stronger, I think, which is kind of the core of what Zonhetl wanted to present, which was a kind of a materialist critique of epistemology, in the sense that the abstractions that are upholded, for instance, in Kantian philosophy, in mathematized science, Galilean, post-Galilean science, and even in Greek philosophy. So you see the historical arch is really big. But these are the kind of the specific moments that are important examples to Zonhetl. All the abstractions that are at work in that have their origin in real exchange abstraction. So I was interested at the time in the problem of the transmission between what is a real abstraction that results from a certain form of behavior, in a certain sense blind to its own effects, right? And the emergence of this kind of homogeneity, and this homogeneity being somewhat transmitted to the mind in the figures of abstraction in the Greek philosophy or in mathematized science. And for instance, the idea of perpetual movement would Zonhetl tries to derive from the movement of commodities. And Kantian, the Kantian understanding of the transcendental subject. Like this is the three, I mean, I'll say, if I remember correctly, these are the three most important moments that Zonhetl is commenting about this transmission. So for me, this was a kind of an issue. Like, I think the thesis is very interesting, very important, because it's connecting a kind of abstraction, is situating abstraction in behavior, and making possible to think of a social synthesis that is performed within behavior itself, but at the same time to say that this is the soul, or sometimes kind of is not always systematic in his vocabulary, but the sole origin of the thinking abstractions or the thought abstractions. And how does this abstraction that is part of a social form transmits itself to the mind? I think he tries to deal with this problem in some different chapters, but they are not very successful. It's usually a kind of an argument that has the form of, where else can somebody see or witness something that is substance-like? For instance, the concept of substance, something that is beyond every accident, like a fundamental concept of Greek philosophy, for instance. Where else can you see something like that other than in minted coin? Like this is the kind of argument that he puts forward. And I was always interested in how actually this gets transmitted to the mind. You just see the coins operate, and this suggests the idea of a substance, a philosophical substance, that it seems to have a huge jump there. And I was parsing out this problem in Salazar terms, in terms of the critique of the given. Like you can't have really just a piece of information, of sensible information. Having the experience of something is not sufficient condition to have this something being in justificatory relations to other pieces of information. Like you need something else to have like just an experience or like seeing something, right? And having it begetting a kind of logical framework. It seems to have more, to need more work to parse this out. So this was, I mean, I'm taking that most of you read section 12, but this was kind of the gist of it. And so the basic idea here is that there's a quote that I used in that section of the atlas. The origin of commodity abstraction is, according to Marx's determination, in a sphere which completely escapes the conceptual language of metaphysical thought. The latter relates things back to consciousness and consciousness to things. There is no third option, which is kind of the, as Toscano says, the heresy of real abstraction. Conversely, the social relation from which the value abstraction is derived does not fit into the dichotomy of things and consciousness. Within the framework of traditional concepts, the phenomenon of the commodity abstraction is an absurdity, something which quite simply cannot exist. It's, as Marx determines, a spatial temporal process, causal in nature. However, its result is an abstraction, that is, an effect of a conceptual nature. I quite like this formulation. This is not in intellectual and manual labor, this is in Bahan form and Bank form, which is a short paper by Zonhettel. However, its result is an abstraction that is an effect of a conceptual nature between the spatial temporal world of things and the ideal world of concepts. Metaphysical thought does not tolerate any common element. These are antinomically separated spheres. So this is one of the issues. So this is thesis one. How does this operate social synthesis? Like I take this from intellectual manual labor. The link connecting, he's discussing a bunch of things, and he says, the link connecting these problems is the social synthesis, which is the network of relations by which society forms a coherent whole. It is around this notion that the major arguments of this book will revolve. As social forms develop and change, so also does the synthesis, which holds together the multiplicity of links operating between men according to the division of labor. For every society made up of plurality of individuals is a network coming into effect through their actions. For those Portuguese-speaking people here who read the Giannotti's text, like you can really see the very intimate connection right there, but with an important set of differences. How they act is of primary importance for the social network. What they think of is of secondary importance. Their activities must interrelate in order to fit into society and must contain at least a minimum of uniformity if the society is to function as a whole. Well, yeah, so there's kind of a certain form of coherence that is operated, that is produced through the real abstraction in capitalist societies, in the societies of exchange, right? So the second thesis I take here from Ansel Biapa, Pourquoi lire Zonhettel aujourd'hui? It's a short text about Zonhettel by Biapa. The origin of the forms of consciousness is neither empirical nor ontological, but historical, which is not a problem, right? Like this is kind of obvious. The forms of thought, these molds in which particular data are cast, do not come, and this is the core of Zonhettel theory, from thought itself, but from human action, not action as such as a category itself philosophical and abstract, but of the historical and concrete action of man. The shapes of the thought, hence the intellect, different from the simple contents of consciousness, are each time the expression of an era in the social relationships of men. Within this context, however, they have objective validity. There you see kind of, it's not really, you don't really see in this quote, I'd say, some kind of inconsistency. It's not really that the problem, but it's a problem of fleshing out what does that mean, because Zonhettel is always saying some stuff like the transmission of the real abstraction to the mind, the transmission of the unchanging character of the commodity to, for instance, the categories of the transcendental subject and stuff like that. So other than just observing a kind of similarity, I don't see really how you will get to flesh out this relationship. This is my main issue. Main point of interest is on Susan Hattle's work, but also main point of, I'd say, work that still has to be done. Like, this is something that interests me. So, yeah, I forgot to add a title, sorry. So in that paper, in that part of the atlas, I was saying our preliminary question concerning real abstractions is the following. If real abstractions are in the mind but not of it, the question of its transmission to the mind arises. A, if the real abstraction is something that happens independently of cognition, it seems to causally constrain behavior, which is not the problem. The problem is this alone doesn't entail by itself being in a justificatory relation to other contents. How the fuck does, you know, the pattern that you are objectifying of a certain behavior gets enmeshed in a justificatory relation with other contents? This is kind of the issue. And B, if the real abstraction is in a justificatory relation, which means has categorical status, it can't be something that emerges independently of cognition simpliciter. This is important. Like, it's not only in the, it is in a certain sense, in a specific sense, independent of cognition, but not independent of cognition, of all cognition, in a certain sense, simpliciter, with any other caveats, you see. So what are the caveats? This is kind of my issue. Yeah.
And just for the sake of people who don't know the terminology, what does justificatory relation mean? Because I know it means something precise, right? Yeah.
Justificatory relation is just, for instance, here, I didn't want to really delve too much into Salazar's vocabulary, but you're right. I mean, the justificatory relation is, for instance, is something that indexes the difference between having an experience and having a concept of an experience. For instance, in Salazar and some of his followers, you have usually, for instance, Robert Brandon uses a lot the example of a parrot. Like, the parrot is able to see maybe the color red and to repeat red when it sees the color red. But is this talking? Is this thinking? Is this having the concept red? So the way they disambiguate between this kind of behavior, which is a differential kind of responsive disposition, which is the technical name they give to this, because the idea is if you show red, it says red. If you show blue patch, it says blue. So it's differential and it's responsive and it is a disposition. This is the minimum that you have to have in order to have like a cognitive system of any sort. But is the minimum the maximum? No, it's not, right? So what's the difference? Like, the difference is that for this kind of philosophy or this kind of theory is that to utter the word red and have the concept red is to know what does it follow from being red. So you have to know the consequences of applying a word red to a certain red patch. So it's not just an association, it is red as being enmeshed within a set of justificatory relations. It is red because it's not blue, it is red because it is colored. So there are consequences to applying red. And the parrot can't know this consequence. He can't show in his behavior that he knows this consequence. So this is a kind of demarcation problem between sentience and sapiens. So, but then it seems that we're back in the empiricist picture, right? Like, if you have to have justificatory relations to have concepts, it seems you can only have that within language and or within mind. You can't really have out there. Out there, it seems you have only blind causality, stuff that happens that you get to conceptualize and justify because you can make them, conceptualize them, make them behave within your justificatory relations, within a certain framework that applies to it. So this is kind of the short answer to Gabriel, which is thank you, a very good point, very good question of clarification. So this is the basic idea, right? So this is why I was saying, like, this part of the atlas, I was trying to see if we can have something that is really important, I think, for the subset of theoretical practice, which is the idea of a social synthesis beyond any kind of, individual or any model that has individuals as, the final instance of determination. You have to have some kind of form, social form, or anyway, something like that. And but at the same time, I wanted to parse out what does it mean, what kind of form you can have, and what is exactly the role of cognition, of a cognitive system within these forms, which I feel is underdeveloped within Zonratto's own kind of framework, as interesting as it is and as important as it is to me and to the STP, I think. Okay. So, so I jump into Giannotti. I will just give you a very, very, very short introduction to what the guy is about. And then I will say what is important for this project in this work. Just what's going on here. Yeah, I know I don't want to see your faces because it's, yeah, this is good. Sorry. So Giannotti is a Brazilian thinker born in 1930, second generation at the philosophy department at the University of São Paulo in the 60s. This is kind of, I would say, an important thing because for those who are readers of Paulo Arantes here, this is exactly the subject of Un Departamento Francês de Ultramar. And, Giannotti is, I think it's the last chapter of that book, Giannotti and Rui Fausto. And so it's a kind of big deal for Brazilian philosophy and this kind of thing. Un Departamento Francês de Ultramar is a very interesting book that documents a kind of import of the French structural reading methods for Brazilian, in São Paulo, in the literate classes of São Paulo, with the intent of, coming up with a certain form of rigorous philosophizing within Brazilian thought. So this was kind of the ideology behind it, and Giannotti was part of it. He was a student of Gilles Gaston Ronget, among others, Jules Villemin, those kind of French epistemologists. He was responsible for the first Portuguese translation of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. It's still in the 60s. People usually don't say that because they usually locate Giannotti's Wittgensteinian transition between the 80s and the 90s. But he was the first translator of the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. But that's it. So he was also one of the founders of SEBRAP, Centro Brasileiro de Análise e Planejamento, in 1969, and of PT, the Workers' Party, in 1980. But then he supported the neoliberalizing government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso from the PSDB in the 90s. So then this was a kind of capital scene here. I mean, he fell out of favor with or a bunch of his former colleagues in Brazilian critical theory. So this is the main problem. Fernando Henrique Cardoso himself, which was the president of Brazil in the 90s, was part of the Seminário Marx that Giannotti was organizing in the University of São Paulo. So he also comes from, Marxology or Marxism in certain sense, but then had this neoliberalizing shift in the 90s, a kind of plea for the modernization of Brazilian capitalism, stuff like that. Well, we don't need to delve into that, but this was kind of the rationale at the time. So also a few books. I'm just doing this because, there's a lot of gringos, so I just want to give a certain idea of what he did. So there are a bunch of other different books, but I would say these are the most important. There's this doctoral thesis on John Stuart Mill about logic. Or is in this phase that he did the translation of the Tractatus, because he was involved in logic with Gaston Granger and other people, with the study of logic. Sorry. And then his first big book, important book, was Origens da Dialética do Trabalho, Origins of the Dialectics of Labor, in 1966. This is the book that Paulo Arantes is commenting in on Departamento Francês de Ultramar. And he does not comment on Trabalho e Reflexão, but I have this. I'm basing my presentation on this commentary by Paulo Arantes on Trabalho e Reflexão that is in O Fio da Meada, not in on Departamento Francês de Ultramar. So then you have Trabalho e Reflexão in 1983, which is the main work that I want to talk about. And then Apresentação do Mundo, Considerações sobre o Pensamento de Ludwig Wittgenstein. So you have this Wittgensteinian turn here, 1995. So, and then there's a bunch of other books, but I think 3 of them are more important here, like Certa Herança Marxista, which is a kind of a certain Marxist heritage is the title. It is him revisiting his Marxist or Marxology works and stuff like that, and also moving forward with his debate with a bunch of these people that were involved in Brazilian critical theory back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s with him. Like, for instance, a central figure within that debate is Rui Fausto. Rui Fausto is very interesting as well. I would love to, at some point, give a presentation on Rui Fausto. Rui Fausto says he's kind of his historical enemy of Giannotti, but they have more in common, I think, that than not. So there's this O Jogo do Belo e do Feio, which is a book about aesthetics or aesthetic judgment, particularly about painting. The Game of the Beautiful and the Ugly is the title. And the last book, which was published in 2020, he died last year, I think it was August 2021, right? And which is a book about Heidegger and Wittgenstein. I think it's kind of lame, this, but anyway, people say that it's a very important, very good book. I still haven't read it because I think those comparisons between Heidegger and Wittgenstein, they're kind of plenty already and kind of lame. But anyway, I should give it a try sometime. So outline of the presentation, of the rest of the presentation, I would like to talk a little bit about the beginning of Trabalho e Reflexão, the reconstruction of abstraction at the beginning of Trabalho e Reflexão, which I relate to the idea of social synthesis in John Hattle's sense. Then there's a kind of a self-criticism by Giannotti, very, very short, and a part 2 which is very short, just 2 slides here, about the discovery of a means of presentation that articulate language games in Apresentação do Mundo, which is the Wittgensteinian book, which I relate to the transmission of abstractions to thought, which is on Hattel thesis 2. And then some final remarks, very straightforward, okay? So here's the Paulo Arantes thing on Giannotti's operational scheme. So this is a quote from O Fio da Meada. In a move of great speculative audacity, Giannotti extrapolates and converts an analogy partially established by Marx between social process of measuring value by the equivalent form and the simple physical equilibrium on a scale between a loaf of sugar and a weight in iron, within the matrix of a social ontology governed by elementary logical operations of identification, which in turn expand, not without first reviewing everything in the human sciences that has to do with identity and different, from Saussure to Skinner, parentheses and all that, and, side comments. This is, Paulo Arantes' style. It's very difficult to read the guy because he's always going in several directions at once. Until rediscovering the infamous socially necessary abstract labor, the measure of value, a necessary illusion that for that very reason does not exist as a given point of reference. Those are very important words for Giannotti. It does not exist as a given point of reference, since the process of mercantile exchange creates its own meter along the way, as Giannotti likes to say. So in the end of the presentation, I will say a little bit something that is more critical that Paulo Arantes says about Giannotti. And I wonder if the idea that the exchange creates its own meter along the way would solve the problem that Paulo Arantes himself is proposing to Giannotti's framework. But anyway, we'll get to that. In short, I draw your attention to the embryo of future trouble, like the trouble he sees in Giannotti's framework. The symbiosis between the source of alienation, germinated in the labor force that only becomes a recognized social thing when measured by the dead labor that composed it, and something like an objective standard of social regulation. So he takes Giannotti to be upholding socially necessary abstract labor as an objective standard of social regulation. And Paul Arendt's main critique of Giannotti by the end of the book, he said, like within page 340 of Trabalho, Reflexão, Giannotti says something to the extent that the measure is destroyed, there's no measure anymore. So for Paul Arendt, Giannotti makes an error there, like he's not focusing on what he should be focusing, which is the power of money to self-valorize and destroy the basis, the very labor basis that gives rise to the self-valorization process. Well, I don't think this is a devastating critique in a certain sense. I mean, maybe Paul Arendt is making more like of an ideological critique, like questioning whether Giannotti, why did Giannotti lost interest in this kind of issue and became a Wittgensteinian in order to save the first chapter, exactly the one I want to talk about, of his Trabalho, Reflexão, and because all the labor how is this labor value theory that he is supposed to be upholding within the book is destroyed by the contemporary state of capital. Okay, so the central problem of the chapter that I want to talk about is how does something that is a multiple of stuff gets condensed into a point or into an object, into something that justifies a certain set of behaviors. And this objectification of that which is scattered as a multiple stimuli, for instance, he uses, and the chapter is really, really wide in its theoretical resources. Like he's using behaviorist psychology, Skinner, he's using Saussure, as Paulo Lentis was saying, he's using a little bit of Quine, he's using Marx, he's using a lot of different things, like, and at this point, he's talking in terms of behaviorist psychology. Like, let's remember how the currency works. Although finite, we cannot circumscribe the contours of the class of objects that can be purchased by it. They do not have any traits in common other than the very fact that they are exchangeable. If it is true that this class, is formed by associating a first primary reinforcer or reinforcement, don't remember what is the technical name, I think it's reinforcement, with this token, then a second and so on, it is in this indefinite progression that all the difficulty is concentrated, because what on the side of the consequence of the conduct presents itself as a temporal succession, on the side of the condition, it condenses itself to a point, a presupposition according to which a person strives to obtain the token. So there is kind of this objectification of something that has value because there's a certain indefinite set of consequence or indefinite set of identifications that that token can have with, for instance, if it's a currency, you're talking about commodities with different commodities, and how does that gets condensed into a point, and which justifies a certain set of behaviors. So exchangeability is a sine qua non condition of the process of obtaining money. Everything happens as if its convertibility was guaranteed in advance. Hence the class information, the progressive sequence of secondary reinforcements presents itself as an already constituted class, as if it were a given. In this movement of reflection, in which the posited becomes a presupposition, the successive established as if it were present. instead of succession, of primary reinforcers, of dispersed multiplicity, its class, its timeless form appears. So I chose this quote because I think it's very striking the way he puts the condensation of a certain social form and the relationship between this which he will call a contemporaneous history following Marx, like the categorical history of a certain social formation, right? That is contemporaneous because it is condensed. It's like a condensed in a certain metastable circuit of sorts, right? And the contradiction between this and the História do vir a ser, as he calls it, the history of becoming. So the history of becoming, that is not the history of this kind of self-reinforcing circuits that produce a certain contemporaneous categorical history, which is contemporaneous history. So the clash between these two things, I take it as the most important point of this chapter. And it is a kind of a foundational gesture for him because he will see it in math, in examples from math, in examples from language use in general, in examples from measure and weighing different objects, and finally in the presupposition of a set of behaviors of the other. So in a certain form of sociality in the end of the chapter. So in the end of the chapter, you get to constitute finally the operational scheme, which is the logical framework he will use in its different modalities and different modifications to read off the historical journey of the formation of capitalism. So this is kind of the journey of the book. I have a little index of subject matters that I'll show you by the end of this specific thing about the first chapter. So given and becoming or become, it is worth emphasizing the difference between the given multiplicity and that multiplicity that presents itself as if it were a given, a matrix of the representation itself. The first takes place in the flow of time. The individual reinforcers of the class that defines a certain reinforcement, the same stimulus that resolves itself into a class of events capable of modifying a probability of response or even adopting a different language. The various profiles of a thing that we discover during our walk around the world. This is kind of the first is kind of behaviorist vocabulary, right? The reinforcers and all of that. And the second, he shifts the vocabulary to the phenomenological vocabulary, like the different profiles of a thing that we discover during our walk around the world. So it's not really, this is an important point. He's not really, adhering or agreeing with behaviorism or phenomenology. It's more like he's using different vocabularies to approach this problem of the condensation of the multiple into one, into an object, into a category, right? So all of them and present in a temporal sequence, one element disappears to make a way for another, but the stimulus in its diversity of events, in the pulsation of its profiles, or any object in its durability is resolved in a synthesis where the temporal succession denoted by and so on appears as its property. What is this presupposed identity as a condition for the identification of any object? So he's using also Hegelian, like there's this Hegelian vocabulary, wherein that which is a product is presupposed and posited as being the object once the concretion of all these different elements come into being, and they form a certain kind of operational scheme. This is the basic idea. So there's three phases of the argument of this first chapter. First is the measure and identification, which is kind of important to, there's a bit about math, but I take it as a kind of a polemical thing about set theory. This might be interesting for the STP, but maybe I think I wasn't so. I would like to delve a little bit more into that in order to talk about this stuff about math. But I think main things that are important for the operational scheme is a measure, like the idea to have like concrete things being measured, and yielding a third, yielding something that is not either the first or the second thing, just a third thing, like weight in itself, for instance. Then language or representation. He thinks of representation as being embedded in language, in concept use, or in signifiers. He's still using the Saussulian mode. The Saussulian vocabulary here, he eventually shifts to the Wittgensteinian one in presentation of the world, but here still the Saussure is the basic vocabulary he's using to talk about language. So language and identification, this is a different issue because the polar thing where, you know, all the identification turn around is a sign. It's not really any concrete thing. So here we have this is a very important thing for STP, I think, like to have a difference between, for instance, predicative logic and an atomic logic in Badiouian terms. I'll parse the problem of measure as a kind of approaching an atomic kind of logic. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that afterwards. And the language and identification bit as kind of a predicative kind of logic, right? And then the identification of behaviors one with another, which forms the operational scheme that retroactively is what is important, what is necessary to have measure and to have language and all the stuff that he's talking about before actually constituting the operational scheme. So, yeah, I think I'm talking for 40 minutes already, right? Well, we'll try to keep it in 1 hour and a bit. Measure and identification, the concrete act of putting the iron and the stone on a scale causes the presupposed weight of the iron to be placed within the stone. Now, however, expressed with a number. The attribute in itself reappears determined as an attribute for itself. Like the point here is how do you, if you are not upholding, for instance, abstract, actually there's a kind of interesting fold here, like because he's not upholding abstract entities at first, so there's no such thing as weight in itself or something like that. You have to have like a process of individualizing that thing that we come to call weight in different objects, and this is done through the comparison and the process of measuring different measures. Measuring understood as, or measurement or measuring understood as the act of measuring something, and measures understood as the concrete objects that give us the measure, right? So the attribute, the isolation of the attribute is something important here because it's eventually, it gets related to the isolation and upholding of, for instance, abstract labor or different kinds of categories that have to need a certain form of abstraction in order to be to have their ontological existence recognized in a certain sense. One of his, actually this is something that I didn't mention before, one of his most important papers is called Against Althusser, so contra Althusser. It's not in any of those books, it's a standalone paper. But for instance, the point there was exactly that, like he thinks that Althusser, in his epistemological way of putting things, is not able to sustain a kind of a real categorical constitution of the social world. Like everything gets conceptualized as an epistemological problem and as an object of knowledge and not as a real object. So here's so the point here is to locate within real practices the emergence of these attributes, properties, things that are not really material things, but that have to have like a site for their emergence within a concrete practice. Okay. So, okay, blah, 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 blah. We were looking for the passage from equivalence to equality. we now discover that the identical, the same, is nothing more than the passage itself, the trajectory of identification, which in virtue of formally determining an object as the intersection of behaviors of comparison and substitution, transforms it into the representative of a posited identity. So you get to use a certain criterion. For instance, he will use the Wittgensteinian example in Presentation of the World, which is very similar to this, like the Parisian meter. You have like a concrete object that functions actually as the representative of an abstract magnitude or a certain form that is responsible for the comparisons that you can make between one and the other, one thing and another. So representation, language as language and identification. So here the problem is, for instance, the variable, the place of a variable, right? Like X is white. The passage between X is white. This is the first phrase is his. That is, examine the presuppositions on which the transformation of a predicative sentence into a sentence possessing the attribute is based. So what's the difference? A predicative sentence for him is X is white. Something is white. And a sentence possessing the attribute is something that X has the property of being white, or X exemplifies whiteness, or X has whiteness, something like that. It seems to say the same thing, right? But in a certain sense, like there's also a difference there, like the individuation of the abstraction. Like you can have like a white or partially white object and another partially white object, but whiteness itself is something, it seems it's a kind of a secondary emerging thing, right? From the different, from the process of triangulation between predicates that you are using and with somebody else and objects, right? So you have to compare different objects when you use the same sign, and by this kind of comparing process, you get to individuate whiteness in a certain sense, but you don't have like this external standard. This is an important thing. Like in the measurement process, here's a quote: a previously chosen object, weight of iron, remains on the sidelines of the identification process as something to which all others refer. Like you can use anything as a criterion. Its inequality with itself, which serves to express and determine the weight of these others, is based on the property of being heavy. Learning or synthesizing the reference of white lacks this external standard. Other identical assumptions are required, which signal both the identity of the signifier and the identity of color. It is now time to examine how the logical form is put, is posited, sorry, this is kind of a bad translation, whose peculiarity is to place white things in the multiplicity of colored objects. From a behavioral point of view, each occurrence of a singular white, as well as from the phenomenological point of view, each appearance of white is formally determined as an inseparable moment of the thing, an inseparable moment of the thing. It is from this that it receives its object. So discourse, therefore, this is an important thing to be compared with what he says afterwards in Presentation of the World. Discourse, therefore, bases its legitimacy on a practical logos. Practical logos is a very important category for Giannotti, and an anti-predicative synthesis that ensures the logical form of the multiple to which predication is connected. Discourse, however, puts this condition of possibility in front of it, admits that the path of identification is resolved, operating as if it were already given. This is important. Like, instead of repeating all the process of identification, discourse already takes it as solved, because we have an up and running language, right? So here's just talking about language. So the categorical elements of this language are already resolved. This process was, you are in media res, you are in the middle of things. The walk becomes a path. So it's not dynamic anymore. It's not a walk, it's like a path, a given path. The attribute, which is nothing more than a process of behavioral synthesis, resulting in the identity of a multiple that becomes an object. Only in this way is it possible to speak of whiteness or of more bizarre attributes that presuppose impossible syntheses. Unlike weighing, predication is armed in the face of reflective identity of the signifier. So the signifier is the thing that is doing that is fixed and doing the unification, the condensation of the multiple, configured by the sentence as a synthesis of the virality of its occurrences. The objectifying movement of the assertion seems to put together all the white things, but in so doing raises to the same level of objectivity all those things that do not have the attribute, but retain the meaning of the sentence. So yeah, well, this will be more interesting when we get to the Apresentação do Mundo part. So we get to the identification of behaviors, which is the most important thing. In the web of behavior, in which the practical logos was aligned, we discovered processes by which objects are identified and individualized by each other. So you have to have one to have the other. It is now time to ask how these behaviors are identified and individualized. So in the practical law process, in the behavior itself, you have the identification, individuation of objects. So, but then you have also the identification, one defined by the other, of behaviors themselves. This is kind of the constitution of the operational scheme. Our first task is therefore to suspend the hypothesis from a ready-made sense or from its behaviorist equivalent. Behaviorist equivalent because, you know, behavior does not uphold the existence of senses, right? Or meaning. We are interested, on the contrary, in the process of constituting this meaning in the fabric of a relationship between individuals who in turn will individualize themselves with reference to the mediating term. The kiss, like you used the example of a kiss, does not just seem to us to be the incarnation of a presupposed mental meaning, an element that is subsumed under a conditioning category. Much less is it resolved in a singular instance by referring to a class of attitudes, which ignores its genesis. It is in each instance confirming a presupposed love and thereby expressing the agent as a lover, confirming this spouse's past actions in such a way that she commits her future actions in that given direction. So actually the behaviors are not only the relationship between, for instance, the measuring relation is not only defining objects or defining elements of the objects or magnitudes that are embedded in objects, and predication is not only defining through its relationship to a different set of singulars, the individuation of certain syntheses or difficult synthesis to achieve, right? But also the behaviors are defining, or the relationship between one and the other, for instance, in a kiss, is not something that is just a result of a given identity, but is specifying the agents that are doing the kissing as lovers. So here's kind of inverting kind of the order of explanation. You don't have the given individuals and they kiss, but you have the kiss that are constituting these individuals as lovers, like they are specifying while negating, configuring while negating these agents. So the operational scheme then becomes a way to understand the way that, for instance, a historical juncture or historical form is subjectivizing the agents that are enmeshed within this historical form. So here you have like a very simplified model for how to understand the way that you could understand the subjectivities involved as a product of a scheme that connects these subjectivities, right? So here's the quote that I love, that I use all the time. I used in the section 12 of the Atlas, used in also the talk that I gave on real abstraction and the given. The object is metamorphosed. Here is the kind of, you know, Paulo Arantes is always making fun of this, like his favorite example of Giannotti's, which is a ball game. Somebody just, you know, is playing ball with somebody else. And so Giannotti goes on and on about this, how the object is metamorphosed. It is worked on so that weight property of the object, among others, can be exercised in the right conditions. So here it has like an unification, like you have the weighting of the object, you have a certain kind of language articulating the behavior, and you have the specification of the agents within a certain specific operational scheme that integrates the physical conditions of the concrete objects within the scheme itself. So I don't think it's silly at all. I think it's a kind of striking thing to be talking about. But anyway, it's always fun to see Paulo Arantes make fun of this. But anyway, the object is metamorphosed. It is worked on so that the weight property of the object, among others, can be exercised in the right conditions. Here, to determine is to negate while configuring. The effectiveness of the game, however, comes to effect this negation. It is the game that is doing the negation of the properties that are irrelevant to the game itself. As natural objects, the soccer ball and the tennis ball are like any two bodies reacting to the impact of forces of nature. But a soccer ball is not the same thing as a tennis ball. That is why the effective game exercises a resistance to weight in a context in which it has already been circumscribed and measured by labor. The operational scheme, constituted by the ball, by its trajectory, by the agents as pitcher and catcher, establishes a very elementary social objectivity. We believe that the operational scheme exemplifies, in a very crude way, the type of object whose plot Marx calls contemporaneous history. I was talking about this in the beginning. The structure of social relations of production constantly nourished by the repeated actions of men, which are objectified in figures such as commodities, capital, and so on. So this is the gist of it. Like the thing is, contemporaneous history has to be re-nourished in a certain sense. Like there are the repeated behaviors that are the result of the condensing of all the reinforcement within these norms or points, like commodity, capital, or the ball game, or whatever. Like, so this is a generalized kind of abstract scheme to make sense of the co-determination of each, element within the scheme. So this is an interesting way to put the problem of abstraction. So instead of, as John Hattel, I would say, wherein you have like a concrete, like John Hattel wants to challenge the empiricist picture, wherein you have this distinction between mental abstract things and concrete objects. But this is already given, this distinction is already given, right? I think what Giannotti gives us that is interesting is that the constitution of the operational scheme itself is not necessarily, all the individualities, let us speak, it's not only in the sense of individual agents, but individual objects are the result of definitions one by the other in a certain sense. So you have like this concretion of what he would later call nonverbal language games within Wittgensteinian parlance that integrates different attributes or things that appear as attributes after the fact and that are reposed or renourished within the operational scheme and presupposed anew, presupposed again. So this is kind of an account that is, I'm not saying that this is complete by any means, but it's very striking in the sense that it shows something like kind of a feedback loop, really, that reenacts like the operational scheme, and by doing so constitutes a categorical structure that is part and parcel of the real of social objectivity. So yeah, this is my comment. I think I've already said what this comment says. Like let us get to the end. more quickly. So the social relationship for him, what matters is the synthesis that brings together a multiplicity of past, present, and future acts in a commitment, in a pact, which separates such acts from their conditions of effectiveness, makes them present themselves as if they were given, so that all agents involved are led to act in accordance with such assumed uniformity. The indefiniteness of the other is embedded of the other agent in this paragraph is embedded in a norm. We can make a social relationship into a pact because an individual reports to another through an object that carries a representative dimension, the anticipation of an action to which a third-party reaction must correspond. But it would be incorrect to identify this pact with a contract. This is a very important issue, I think, in something that, I get a lot like criticism with that, like, oh, so this is a form of social contract. No, it would be incorrect to identify this pact with a contract, limitation of personal wills in the sense of reaching a previously foreseen end. So there's no foreseen end. So the agents themselves, the way they act is, a product of their operational scheme themselves, but itself, sorry. We should here avoid two parallel mistakes. On the one hand, subjectivism that resolves the social relationship in a web between previously constituted consciousnesses. On the other hand, the objectivism that withdraws from any representative anticipatory dimension. Okay, so in the end, there's this little thing about the labor process. I'm getting to the end, right? So that is, bear with me just a little bit. In the instrument, the participation of the other is easier to be evidenced. A fishing net, for example, becomes more effective when handled collectively, because while someone on the beach can hold one of its ends, another takes it out to sea. The other appears here as a partner in the implementation of an instrument, specifying itself as an insurer, handler, and so on, each limiting itself to perform, albeit vicariously, a task. The indefiniteness of someone who can assume the most varied features, somebody really indefinite, right, is consolidated in a determined phase, totally focused on the execution of a service. From this conjunction between object and the instrument, the product emerges. Product sets up the remains of the reflective movement. The product is the remains of the reflective movement, I think is a better translation. This means that self-consumption itself, because it takes place in a context in which third parties appear in various forms, already implies a recognition that that result of work can return, according to a consensus of all, to the work process that gave it origin. So this is kind of his announcing the idea that there is consumption that is consumed in the production process itself. So you're producing something that gets reused within, gets, how to say that, re-injected within the production process. And this will be, of course, much more developed when he's talking about labor in the historical capitalist sense, in the industrial sense. But here's the first chapter, like here's this constitution of a certain abstract framework for talking about this kind of thing, right? So here's the general index. I wanted to give like a whole picture of the book because I think it's a monumental thing, really. But yeah, I can only, as you can see, I'm already 1 hour in, finishing right now in a bit. So I just want to have to give a general idea of what's in the book. So you have like six different chapters. The Imperativos da Ilusão is the first one. And then there's the objects of the chapters, like measure, language, social relations, the first one. Then you have the Ardil do Trabalho, which deals with the formation of a technical object, labor process, and of metabolism with nature. Okay. Third chapter, Formas da Sociabilidade Primitiva, deals with the gift and simple exchange. Poder, Riqueza Social e Estado deals with money, the treasure and state. Formas da Sociabilidade Capitalista, capital and class, of course, and value. História e Revolução, the history of the becoming versus the contemporaneous history. Here he goes back to the issue of history, which is quite important in the first chapter as well, and the destruction of measure that Paulo Arantes was talking about in his comment. So he's in the introduction to Presentation of the World, he gives this self-criticism He says, a closer reading of philosophical investigations, now Wittgenstein, showed me that the difference between operational scheme and language, as it was made in my first chapter, Imperatives d'Illusion, Imperatives of Illusion, still retained a phenomenological flavor that needed to be rethought. Basically, two procedures of analysis were mixed. I kind of agree with that, but I have to parse that out better. A doctrine of expression in which something is expressed in another, projecting itself integrally in it, so measure and all the operational scheme, one picture is projected into catcher and all of that. And an analysis of language that insists on its pragmatic commitments. But these two sides did not fit perfectly together on the same coin. So that in my text, the relations between operative schemes or operational schemes and the logical linguistic structures themselves became obscure somewhat. So he's using the idea of means of presentation that comes from Wittgenstein, Philosophical Investigations, paragraph 50. I think the important thing is the second one. I won't read the first one. We can put it like this. This sample, a sample that you use, is an instrument of the language used in ascriptions of color. Like the idea of you having like a sepia, like the color sepia. There's a standard for sepia, right? That is, for instance, kept hermetically sealed, right? In this language game, it is not something that is represented, but is a means of representation. So within language, you are using criteria that are embedded or situated within concrete things. And just this goes for an element in language game 48, when this is not as relevant, but yeah, I think the first one the first paragraph talks about the Parisian meters. Like, one would, however, like to say existence cannot be attributed to an element, for if it did not exist, one could not even name it, and so one could say nothing at all of it. So this is typical Wittgenstein. But let us consider an analogous case. There is one thing of which one can say neither that is 1 meter long, nor that it is not 1 meter long, and that is the standard meter in Paris, because the standard meter in Paris is the standard for saying that something is 1 meter long. So you can't really say that it is 1 meter long because it is the standard. So this is the simple Wittgensteinian joke here, almost like a joke, but there's an important point about analyticity here. But anyway, so anyway, the important thing here, like before I get enmeshed in a bunch of difficulties, because if you leave me, I will start, philosophizing too much. But is the fact that language it does not have only the sign or the signifier, like it's also linked to the world in the adoption of criteria that are kind of linked, that are embedded in concrete situations as well. So this is part and parcel of Wittgensteinian critique of philosophy, which is an important thing. So here is Giannotti in Apresentação do Mundo, links to the context of the movement of all language. The proposition works without having a paradigmatic form on the horizon. Here is criticizing the idea of logical form and that any proposition would adhere to, right? But for that, it needs to incorporate its material supports as a rule, since it can only be followed to the extent that the intentions and conditions of existence of the acts of following are appropriate to its fulfillment. In this way, following a rule becomes a form of life, an ingrained habit, necessarily put in perspective in the statement itself. So it's something that is present in every statement, as long as the conditions for understanding a statement is the embeddedness of in a form of life that takes its material supports as criteria, as rules for the unfolding of language. So you can recognize very closely something that is very close to the operational scheme, but you don't have that, anti-predictative thing, like this is done within language itself. It's not a being in the world prior to any logical consideration, but a fact that in general can be converted into a norm, which means of presentation are engaged in the world as a whole. But while phenomenology works with the found in Lebenswelt concept, the world of life, Wittgenstein insists on a form of living, in short, a cultural structure. I don't like cultural here, but anyway, cultural structure posed as a form through the exercise of language, therefore a logical form of life. So the three moments in the identification of objects that I think are important with the two texts, like measure and identification, which deals with concrete measures individuating an abstract property through their process of mutual identification and comparison, right? Language and identification is the second moment, that signifier as fulcrum of multiple identifications. And language and the third one only arrives in presentation of the world. This is why I think this book should be respected. Concrete measures are the engaging language in the world. So you have, like, in the same place, language with all its tendency of autonomization, but also the passageways wherein it is connected to concrete property of things in a certain sense. So I take it that from all this presentation we can talk about kind of types of abstraction, like practical abstraction. For instance, the mediation of which is physical labor. I'll take the ball game as an example. Abstraction of measure, like where it's not the end is not just the activity that you're making, but you want to individuate a certain means that will be the third that make the mediation between two things that you are measuring. So the abstraction of measure, the mediation of which is the measuring or the comparison, the measurement or the comparison. Real abstraction, mediation of which is money in exchange, like it's a much greater kind of type of abstraction, because then you have like a generalized kind of equivalence. It's not situated or embedded in any concrete property of things, right, in a certain sense. And linguistic abstraction, the mediation of which is the sign in a broad sense, not necessarily the signifier as in Trabalho, Reflexão. But linguistic abstraction has this kind of capacity to be absolutely autonomized. For instance, this is why you can have like a Wittgensteinian critique of philosophy, like the idea that you can have theories that don't explain anything because they are misusing language, because you don't have really an infrastructure that is concrete and present at hand all the time within the linguistic expression. So it's too free. Language is almost like it has too much freedom in a certain sense. So it is turning in the air, like without any reference. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I would say that this is kind of interesting to the ESTP, because I have the impression that we might have already the formal means to defining all these kind of different abstractions and their dependency conditions to, you know, certain sites or certain situations wherein they emerge, right? But I didn't have the time to, you know, go through our other presentations and try to look into it. But this is a thing that I was thinking about. One final issue is this idea that I was talking about the Giannotti's error. Like Giannotti was doing very well, and he says a bunch of funny things. At least he did not get carried away in the conversation of the false problem of transformation from value into price of production, nor did he get involved via Sraffa in the neo-Ricardian aporia of the invariant pattern of value. There's a chapter, half a chapter about Sraffa in Trabalho, Reflexão, which I don't understand really, so don't ask me about that. But insisted rightly on the question of measure of value, so much that he ended up leaving aside the main thing, the law of the movement of capital, to speak in jargon from now on, whose only purpose is to valorize itself, so that the so-called law of value, unless you unduly confine it to the preliminary scope of that simple mercantile society of independent producers, is only fully such when it commands the process of capital valorization. Having made this reservation, the path toward the crisis would be another one on which you're asking for my opinion, to see how capital, as it historically approaches concept, its more general form, and apparently it moves further and further away from its origin, labor value. This is pure Hegel. I think Giannotti would gladly agree. This means, to be very short, at the point of arrival of the process of the valorization of capital, its concept, in the Hegelian sense, becomes capital in the form of abstract value, money, which consequently starts to buy less and less living labor, and thus it moves further and further away from its origin, as I told you. that the automatic process of valorizing capital is only what it is because it is at the same time a process of devaluation of work, precisely in a language that Giannotti should appreciate. You know that we were once a large family. I left in the jokes, right? I think Paulo Arantes is a funny guy. That such a system of commodity production tends to annihilate its basis of valorization, that is to devaluate its own measure. So you have to agree that our friend Giannotti let the real fetish slip, money, to end up, despite everything, hypostatizing on one side labor value as a standard of measurement, on the other hand, technical progress, which in itself does not explain anything about the dynamics of the system. So this is a kind of a critique of, he's very appreciative of the operational scheme, but in the end, it seems that Paulo Arantes is thinking that the idea of an operational scheme does not make justice to the autonomization of value within the capital self-valorization process, something like that. Yeah, I think this is a valid critique as it is to Trabalho e Reflexão, but I don't think it's impossible to compatibilize. So this is my last thing. But in the interval between history of becoming and contemporaneous history, can't one possibly find the means for the autonomization of one abstraction that emerges from a previous operational scheme? So this would be something that Giannotti didn't do, but perhaps is doable. Okay. So this was it.
Are we taking that 5-minute break before going into debate like was suggested?
Should we?
What do you guys think?
Do you want to? I should stop recording. What was your last?
We left it recording last time. Just so okay. No.
So let's take 5. Let's take 5.
Yeah. Okay. Be right back.
Okay.
Man, Paulo Arantes is way too mean with Giannotti.
He's very mean. Rafael, I don't think he's here, and probably he wants to tell the gossip. But he found out something funny.
I wanted to tell this to you in person because I think you would love it. But I had a meeting with him last week and to talk about Fio da Meada. And one of the things he said is that he admitted that Fio da Meada is a work of fiction. There was no conversation. He wrote all the parts. And it's funny because I was just looking at the PDF and the book ends with a 20-page discussion that he isn't involved. So I think that even when I read it, I think it wasn't really, okay, he left the conversation, so I'll just shut the book down. But now I want to reread the book, knowing, and it's a book that he said what he was going to do if he stayed in philosophy.
Okay, yeah.
So it's a sort of a like end tour.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that's bizarre. Maybe it's not sure. Yeah, it's kind of a Platonic dialogue then.
yeah, I mean, I didn't say that to him because I think I didn't want to reveal myself as too much of a Platonist. But yeah, that's what I thought. I mean, you are a Platonist then. That's what you're doing. This is the dialogue of the soul between itself. But it's a very weird book in general.
Have you read Departamento in its entirety? Ultramar?
Not, I mean, I've read it. I think I've read over 70% of it.
Yeah, the last chapter, I mean, the Bento Prado and the Giannotti chapters are simply amazing. I mean, it's really, really strong, I think.
Yeah, I want to, but this is like, man, I need some time to do this. Because I think there's a lot of threads to pull if you read all, because there was this article recently, I don't know if you saw it, about like it's a general presentation of Paulo Arantes' work.
Yeah, it's Pedro Rocha. Pedro
yes,
Rocha. It's called O Fio da Meada, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, but I just don't like it. I think it's a bad presentation done by a student who's trying to sum up the main lines in each book, and it doesn't make any sense for someone who hasn't read Paulo Arantes, who doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah. I think it's helpful, but it's more like a summary than a proper paper that is, making all the mediations. Yeah. And it says it's kind of weird form where you have like a couple of sections, and the sections are one breaking from each other. Like, yeah, here he's talking about this, and here he's talking about that. Yeah, but it is helpful because Paulo Arantes is quite chaotic to understand like what's going on. I mean,
it's like an intelligible summary, like index summary.
Yeah,
but I think there's still something to be done to connect all the dots. I mean, I'd like to do it eventually, but
yeah, I'm fucked because I was trying to do it because I have to do this critical review of Formação e Desconstrução for Safatlis magazine.
Which magazine? He has a magazine now?
A new one. Yes. There's a new stuff going on. So yeah. So they asked me because I'm not an Arantian. Yeah, they wanted somebody who would actually criticize him.
Okay.
But it's really hard because it's really hard to actually get to understand fully what does it work, how it works, right?
Yeah, and I think that book is like all his works. It's really weird to you can't read it alone. I mean, I think there's one piece there that stands out for me at least, which is the Rorty piece, which is and this might I mean it's a pity that Daniel isn't here because it's like about the origins of the American scholars and philosophers, and I think it's just brilliant. But
yeah, it's the answer to Bento Prado, right? Like there's a Bento Prado paper, and then there's Paulo Arantes' answer. I'm starting my review from that paper. That's my starting point.
That's good. That's good. Please share it with me while you're writing.
Yeah. So. Do you want to talk something? Go back to the presentation, some aspect, anything?
One thing I thought could be useful, both for the sake of also people arrive during, and just to make sure that we also are like on the same page starting the discussion, just tell me if this makes sense as a summary of Giannotti's argument, because I mean, I get the tripartite kind of 3+1, right? Measure and identification, language identification, then identification of behaviors plus language and measure, which is, let's say, the reworked version of it, right? But like from reading the text, I had the impression that he starts with this problem of what is a social phenomena. He says, well, it's a complicated thing to define. We don't want to simply assume it's like a given object that we start from. So it looks to me that the justification for why he's not, like we need to start from something before what he calls a given multiplicity. It's because we know social phenomena are not just like physical things. So there's something specific about how they're formed that seems to be more important than, you know, a physical thing is just a given in that sense, right? So it kind of explains why he needs to start from a bit before the constitution of social phenomena. And then he says, he has that first discussion where he makes a comparison between, he starts from he shows that you can move this relation from, let's say, how something appears to you to the relation between, for example, two heavy things, right? Which is this measure and like what is caught up of the objects in the comparison. So that would be the first step. Then the second is, well, but you would never be able to generalize from these comparisons to, let's say, this attribute, which is then kind of fixed on the object, if it wasn't for the sort of invertive capacity or inversive capacity of language, which discourse inverts the before and after, right? Rather than having things, rather than saying things like, I've compared many things, this looks like this is white, you just say this thing is white, right? So, and that's why we compared them. So
white is existing now. You can
exactly. Gives the attribute existence. So this third thing in the comparison becomes, let's say, kind of reified because language has already this tendency to do this. And then he says, well, but this is actually going to function like a kind of feedback system, because now this is going to influence the behavior of people who are caught up in that comparison. So this kind of language abstraction that happens, that reified the comparison abstraction, it's going to be infusing the behavior itself. So people now are going to behave as if objects are white, right? So if I understand correctly, that's kind of like what this operational schema is trying to show step by step, right? From the sort of initial action that slowly gets more and more caught up in all these different steps. Right?
I think there's one further point, which is in the same way that one attribute is specified by comparing objects, the agents are specified within the operational scheme as well. So for instance, this is the thing about the kiss, like it's not like something that you add to somebody that is already a thing, and then it kisses another it that is already a thing. You see, no, the kiss, the operational scheme of the kiss specifies them as lovers in a certain sense. So there is also the movement of specification of the agents themselves. They are specified as a certain sort of thing or as having a certain property by the participation in the operational scheme itself. So this is a kind of interesting. I don't think Giannotti develops this too much in the book, in the rest of the book, but it's this kind of interesting. For instance, in things like, I mean, people who are involved in real subsumption, and real subsumption in the sense of, you know, having all your subjective properties being a product of capital and this kind of thing. Like, I'm not sure it gives credence to that necessarily, but I think it gives a kind of infrastructure to understand how being in an operational scheme specifies the behavior of not only the behavior, but behaving in a certain way because of the operational scheme specifies the agents themselves as being the type of agents they are. Like, for instance, workers in a factory or whatever.
So just to clarify, because I don't remember from reading it how this transition goes, because like first we have the objects being measured, but for example, in the kiss, it's almost like the agents are being measured. Right? So
exactly. The
agents
no longer
he doesn't treat two people kissing as two heavy things on a weight. He treats it as two people comparing something that are on a weight, on a scale.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the middle of the process, we no longer are concerned with objects being compared, but with agents who are also transformed by the comparison. But in the debate about weights, the agents weren't really included yet.
No, exactly. He started from objects and then he moved on to behaviors.
I see.
Yeah, because eventually he wants to get into metabolism. Like first step, like in your Ardil do Trabalho, metabolism with nature. So you have to have objects measuring themselves, and you have to have your agents specifying them as extractors of, products. So yeah, this is the ingredients to have like the scheme, the technical scheme, and the metabolic scheme at first in what you do.
Can I ask by metabolism here? Do you mean just like a self-referential system or something that's like self-sustaining or something, or what is it? There's a dimension of that, but I don't think this is, in the technical scheme at first, this is not the issue. It's just the fact that you have a necessary relationship, for instance, with the earth, with natural objects that are transformed by the production process. So he was trying to give ingredients to understand the mutual specification of agents within the production process. This is where all this weird stuff connects with his, Marxology in a certain sense. So you have metabolism at first, and then you have this kind of course, social reproduction, but also one very important point for him is when you start producing the means of production as well. So then you have this very important feedback that is responsible in his account for a bunch of things. I think this is a book that should be read in its entirety. It's impossible to just give a whole account, and I'm not even competent for that yet. But yeah.
I don't want to kind of monopolize questions. I have a bunch of things I wanted to understand a bit better, but just to see if anyone else wants to jump in.
I have a kind of half question because I joined late, so I didn't catch everything at the beginning. But this is really interesting. It sounds very similar to how we've discussed like labor time and socially necessary labor time.
Yep.
Could you talk a bit about that? Like, I know you mentioned it briefly, but I didn't fully see the connection there. But it does seem like you have these workers working, even I know they're not even workers yet, but you have like labor power maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
They're objects, right? And then from this kind of, there's almost like this moment of arbitrary, like something in common is extracted from that interplay, and then that becomes the next stage in the attribute, let's say, socially necessary labor time.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Like that's exactly it. Like you have a production process, and in order to measure the I don't understand how to translate lote. The lote that is the lote of production, the amount of production that is that ought to return to those doing participating in the operational scheme of the production process. You have to homogenize this in a certain way. So for him, abstract labor time, if I'm not mistaken, maybe there's some kind of subtle difference, but from what I understand, because these are not the chapters that I read as exactly, but socially necessary abstract labor time comes from the necessity of allocating the results, the product of the labor process within the participants, between the participants of the labor process. So this homogeneous thing is at play here. And what Paulo Arantes is criticizing actually is kind of an interesting thing, is that in the final chapter, Giannotti says that you don't have this measure anymore because science is part of the production process, and this kind of makes the abstract labor not tenable anymore because you have incomparability into of types of labor. So you don't have any more abstract, socially necessary abstract labor in order to measure, kind of the quantitative basis of value. So this is the explosion of value for him. This is why Paulo Arantes says something to the extent that, yeah, you're not taking into account the self-valorization process itself. So it's from above, it's not from below. It's not the problem of the differentiation of labor, the scattering of labor that makes the measure explode. The measure is exploded by the self-valorization of value itself. So this is, as I understand, is the basic disagreement there, you see. Gabriel.
I was looking into the bibliography of the book because there is a very I think you can very much frame Paulo Arantes' critique in the kind of general debate that you have within Marxism today between a position more committed to the ontology of labor, which implies that you will be able to derive pretty much the structure of social systems from the way labor is ontologically determined, and then how this allows us to further qualify relations between workers and where the product goes, so on and so forth. And this other approach, which is very it's self-fractured. I mean, both of them have many, many different positions, but it usually starts from the principle that, well, there wasn't even such a thing called labor until very recently. So labor would be a very late attribute in the process of, forced or free cooperation between people. And that, it takes a very high level of abstraction for people to compare what they're doing, and the predicate that they extract is we're working and not, we're fishing, as an example.
Yeah.
So,
Giannotti tries to defend himself from that, saying that this is not labor yet and stuff like that. It seems from chapter 1. Yeah, he tries. I think he's aware of this problem, like the historicization of labor problem in a certain sense. So he's not saying it is labor as we get today. It's like it's a simplified operational scheme. So this is why he comes up with a bunch of different vocabulary. But production process and division of the amount of the product. This is all starts sounding like labor, and I think Paulo Arantes picks on that in his critique. He says like he's retroactively positing then labor back into the simple exchange and the gift societies and all that. So
yeah, I saw that there. I mean, I've read most of it. I didn't get to read everything, but I've read the following chapters, and I can see that there is a logical necessity that he would move from the operational schema to some sort of philosophical anthropology of the most primitive basic forms of human interaction, because he could just call it organization rather than labor, and
that's good.
Would spare himself some problems. But I just wanted to make some comments that I think it was really great to see the presentation so well schematized, because I think it makes for a much easier way for us to parse out a problem and give credence to the fact that this definitely needs to be further developed. But at the same time, I think it's easier to demarcate some things that usually are hard for us to do, because one thing that it's very fundamental that I really wanted to hear you speak a bit more about, because I'm not sure if this is even a problem. Perhaps it's not a problem, but the way you parse some Rattle's thesis, you arrive at this kind of impasse. You need to choose between the A and B that you propose, which makes total sense to me. Okay, fine, there is something like the act of exchange. It implies some abstraction. Okay, now you're telling me this precedes ideal abstractions and there's a process of conversion. But just conversing this sort of indexed form into the mind, now I can say something like pure space, timelessness. That's not a concept, right? Concept implies consequence, as you said, right? Yeah. And that's why I asked you about the justification, because in both claims, it's already implied that we want to know if you can actually give reasons using these new concepts. Are they entangled in the web of kind of reason in that particular normative sense, or are they just like free-floating shit? Like, okay, pure oneness, right?
Yeah.
It could be argued that philosophers really never made any consequential remarks out of these things, so that it's actually true that it never became a concept.
There's a charitable reading that one can make of that. Like, it's a piecemeal thing. You get a little bit of this, a little bit of that, like minted coin. So you see, well, I can exchange this you know, how do you say that? Moeda gasta, this
worn out currency.
Worn out coins for another, because it's not you know, physical properties that are important. It's properties that's representative of value or something like that. So you can make a charitable reading of a certain sort of historical fiction that I think is much akin, for instance, to if you go to sellers like our Rileyan ancestors and the myth of Jones, this kind of thing. Of course, there was no Jones. This never happened. So it's a kind of a plausible historical fiction. And I tend to read Zonhetl in a charitable sense in that way. Like, okay, there's a possible historical fiction wherein like some philosopher look at the functioning of coins and says, oh, there you get something that for, you know, for which the physical, it's physical, my English is I'm getting tired, sorry. Their physical, I don't know, deterioration is not important, for instance. So you have this judgment of the oneness, of the sameness within the exchange process and all that. So there you get the idea of everything is water, everything is fire, everything is substance, everything is one. Yeah.
But the thing is, okay, my point there is the following, which I think if it makes sense to you, it might also sort out some different questions, because this particular reading of what he means by ideal abstraction is, let's say, a more robust thing you're bringing into the picture to help us kind of, okay, let's organize this question of conversion of real into ideal abstraction. But one of the implications of it is that what we're looking to explain is the transformation of these real abstractions into things that are parts of norms, parts of, you know, protocols for using concepts. Now, the thing that for me kind of underlies this whole thing is that, and Giannotti says this in the beginning of his chapter on capital. He says, it's really cool. He says, you know, one of the definitive things about, let me just find the exact sentence. He says, shit, the book is long. Yeah, he says, capitalist is every society whose production is permeated by capital. This proposition, however, makes no sense to those who make capital productive factor or in society. So, I mean, now that I read it, it has nothing to do with what I want to say, but my misreading makes sense. He's criticizing other theories, but actually, for 99% of the people who know how to behave with money, they have absolutely no idea in their chains of reasons. Nothing that is really meaningful to the functioning of capitalism is actually playing a part.
Yeah.
Right. It's almost like you had a clock where the language game of small cogs that are interacting are slightly different. Like, I just want to win against you and turn the cog here. But nobody actually plays the language game of the thing. Like, I never need to say, yeah, I play a part like a small cog in this big clock. So there seems to me that there is a slight, it's two things that I don't think contradict anything you said, but I think they facilitate dividing the problem. The first is that I think that this problem is absolutely real, which is, what the fuck is the sort of behavioral protocol and how could it be constituted for the synthetic dimension of commodity exchange? That's a real problem. I think Giannotti is trying to move in that direction. Yeah. But that, if we have, let's say, a more pluralist understanding of reason, in the sense that one of the aspects of reason is the fact that concepts are, you know, actionable counterparts of this asking and giving reason game. That's one thing. But there's also, let's say, some other aspect I wouldn't unqualified. So in that sense, you could imagine that you need to convert twice. You need to convert real abstraction into something that is caught up in a normative procedure, but that nothing guarantees that that normative procedure is capable of giving reasons for the functioning of exchange. It will give reason for the functioning of the agents of exchange.
Yeah. Like let me parse this in another sense. Like it has to give reasons or norms for a certain functioning, but the functioning of the mechanism by which this functioning emerges is not transparent. Like,
yeah, you want to see a good example of this? The way Lévi-Strauss defines generalized exchange in the elementary structure of kinship. Because the first thing you have there is that no longer have like groups exchanging women or gifts amongst each other. So I give you something because I know you're going to give me something else, but I give you something because you're going to give to a third party who's going to give to a fourth party, and I might get it back in the end of the circuit.
mm-hmm.
If you ask people what the fuck they're doing, they're gonna, like, the internal language of that situation involves, you know, a certain group of actors who, some of them are in the exchange, some of them are just watching the exchange, and you might get punished if you don't complete it. So that gives you the normative compulsive dimension, you know, like, don't fuck this up, you're gonna, you know, fuck your whole clan up if you don't do it. So there is a compulsion, it works, it's totally real, but it's just not necessarily the general form of talking about how to create general operational schemas. So it seems to me that it's not a contradiction, because the more you push Sonretto to the direction of saying that there is a mismatch between the general social syntheses of a capitalist society and what people think, the more pressing it is the issue of how the hell then are these normative games constructed, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's one point. The second point that I think concerning Sonretto is also important to consider is that Sonretto also divides real abstraction into two moments, because his basic argument, seems to me, is that the act of exchange is abstract versus what people are thinking. There's no money involved. Just the exchange of commodities, any two given commodities, already implies that abstraction.
Yeah,
and that predates.
And he says it's what I think is quite weird, but it's growing. I like it a bit more now. It's like the spatial temporal separation between the use act and the act of exchange. Like, you have to have like spatial temporal separation. He considers the act of exchange as something like it's kind of completely separated from use in a certain sense. So it is in the act. The abstraction is in the act itself, because you have to consider the commodity as unchanged through the act of exchange. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of things to critique in Sonretto's, like, from a strictly Marxist position. A lot of people want to take his idea that acts can have abstraction, but not everyone agrees that you will build the whole thing on the act of exchange.
From circulation.
But you can separate that idea of an act that is reliant on some abstraction taking place from money appearing, because the whole point is that we've been doing this forever, but there are certain things we only started talking about in ideal abstractions once coined money appeared, capturing a property that was there before money. So there is a distinction between commodity abstraction and money abstraction.
Right? Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
So
that's a
good reading. Much.
No, I think changes a little bit. It's a good reading. I don't think, though, that it is as emphasized in Sonretto's own text. Like, you could mix this up. I don't think.
No, I can see, but I mean, like, if that was truly central, when he talks about act of exchange, he would have to complete act of exchange for money.
Yeah.
And he does, and he just needs for the bag of rice I have and the goats you have to, for 1 second, to remain what they are. Otherwise, we wouldn't even have a way to match that equivalent. Right?
That's correct.
So it's funny that he doesn't really describe it in this way, but there is a real redoubling of the abstraction. Like, there is the act of abstraction, then there is an object outside of that act.
Like there's an active abstraction and there's the necessary technology for representing the value. Like it starts exchanging commodity, then he talks about precious metals. So you have to melt the thing, and you know, so it's kind of there's a technical problem there. So you just let's have like currency, minted coin. So this is
so there is so I think it fits this idea of this process of measure, and then but then it's funny because money appears as a sort of, you could call it, okay, it's symbolic already, but it's the language and identification part happens with money. So you know, like Marx has this difference between accidental form of value, extended form, all the way to the universal equivalent, and act of exchange is accidental. It doesn't guarantee that even though we equated the values, that another act will equate the values. It has no consistency as a synthesis. But once we all know every act needs to be also commensurate with money, then these comparisons become more stable. Which I think in that sense, money plays the part of, let's say, fixating the predicate, right? It's with money that you invert the.
I think language is very close to money in Giannotti's account. Yeah.
And then this brings me to my last question, which I think it's the thing that I would explore the most as a way to kind of allowing us to go in both directions at the same time. Like on one direction, saying something like, money is the fixed point for certain normative processes that are from which we don't count as agents, because you count as an agent as a bearer of labor power, but as labor power, you're not an agent, you're an object. You're more like the thing being weighted in the scale than the agents measuring it, right? Money is measuring you as a laborer. So there is one perspective in which we appear as objects, not as agents. But that only makes it more important to actually account for, okay, but we still see ourselves as agents. So how do you account for that?
That's exactly what I want. Exactly.
And I wonder if you would agree with this. Like right at the beginning of the chapter, he quotes, I never know how to say the guy's name, Hemslev.
I say it like that. Hemslev.
Hemslev. That guy, and he says he says some shit about the guy, but he says the guy was right in one thing, which is comparing language and economics and saying the difference is that language doesn't have a fixed point and economy has a fixed point. So on the path that takes humans as objects, just like any other thing, like not even as objects, as commodities, because commodity is not the same as object. You get the sort of Sonretalian sort of immanent economic practice of we came up with money, now we can compare objects through money and ourselves as objects and blah, 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 blah. But on the other path, language needs to be the core thing. And perhaps the big difference that we can use to navigate this is that indexical shifters play the role that money in language that money plays in economy, right? Every statement in an economic system, the proper way of framing the internal language is where money says things in the first person, right? I see a commodity as being worth 10 of, and I see that other commodity as being worth 10. Like it's, the shifter is fixed to where money is. If money values, all the attributes vary. Just like if I change my tastes, the attributes of things might be reevaluated. So I have the impression that perhaps it would be, I'm not sure if this is a necessity in this particular normative approach, but I have the impression that the way to get to the normative gains or to compatibilize that interpretation of Sonretto with Giannotti is probably to see what happens to this asubjective or this fixed point games with money as index, the index of it. When you project it back to language games that they will be situated in the world by indexicals and shifters that actually locate us, right? That's why agents are reintroduced into the picture, but it gets a weirdly deformed picture. But as long as it makes the larger picture function, even if it's giving weird reasons for things like, I use money because, Christ said, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, give to God what is God's. I mean, I'm going to give Caesar what's Caesar. Here it is. It has Caesar's face on it. Like it actually works. If you say this, it will function perfectly, right? It's not irrational, it's perfectly rational.
Yeah.
Right? So I wonder if that problem of indexicals and shifters in language versus in economy isn't a good way to separate the two questions while using the same basic schema.
Yeah, that's, I think, yeah, I didn't really express it like that. I think it touches upon what I wanted to do actually. Yeah, of course, language, what I think Giannotti wants to do is kind of approximate the measure that money is doing to the language games that we are enmeshed in the way that the operational scheme is measuring the participants in a certain sense. So I think his way of unifying things has to do with the fact that we are agents in a certain sense, but we are not agents in a substantive metaphysical sense of being the originator of the actions. We are being specified by the diagram, so to speak, that we are part of. So we are being specified or being measured by the operational scheme as a whole. So, of course, that seems to be compatible with the function of money. I think that is what he wants in Trabalho, Reflexão. Not sure if he gets it, but I think it's going in that direction. I think, and that's yeah.
But you know, like just to conclude, this is why I wonder if his comment in presentation of the world should be taken as a deficit or as a good thing when he says the phenomenological and the linguistic are not matching up perfectly.
Yeah.
Well, in a certain sense, it seems like that might be a property of the particular operational schema he wants to understand, where it does look like the, you know,
yeah,
the
that's a
shape,
good point. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, perhaps.
you know, like it might be, there might be something there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think of course, he doesn't mean that. He means like, yeah, I'm using phenomenology and, you know, linguistics, and here you have like this approach that situates language within, you know, concreteness of criteria, worldly criteria, you see, that are enmeshed in language and stuff like that. So there's a kind of unification. But yeah, you're right in the sense that perhaps his self-criticism in terms of methodological terms has actually a different reference, the reference of which is actually the gap between language and the participation in the operational scheme of money use and capital. Yeah, in a certain sense. Yeah, that's a good hypothesis. Have to think about it more.
Like it might even show that, you know, the problem is not the operational schema and the fact that it starts with the issue of measure and so on. Like you could turn Paulo Arandt's critique to, which I don't think is what he means, but to say, no, it actually applies. It's just that in the case of capitalist economies as a game, the subject, which is, you know, Marx called it an automatic subject, the itself, right, is not a human, is that thing there. But then the language works. Like, then you actually get it to look like, which is like the counterintuitive thesis that, you know, to make perfect logical sense of the structure of economic behavior, you need to invert who acts and what's acted upon, even though you cannot lose, like it needs to remain commensurate with the fact that from our perspective, you should be able to reconstruct that functioning from a series of language games where we are actually, you know, actors. So there should be some level of equivalence between these two interpretations, even though some features won't appear until you describe part of it inverted. You know, I don't, something like
I see. I see what you mean. But I don't see this solving the problem of the transmission of the abstraction to the mind, all that, you know, Zunhattel thing. I mean, this.
Yeah, but then I would say two things there. Like one thing I've been actually I won't say anything because John has his raise. Yeah. Ran haze forever. Sorry.
John.
Sorry, hey. John. He's asleep after I spoke.
Oh no, it's all good. Actually, your comments, Gabriel, helped me kind of formulate my question, which is something I've been trying to formulate since I read your paper originally, JP, which it seems like, to basically ask is like those 2 points that you kind of just highlighted in terms of how we think about making money as agents versus the actual logic of exchange operations and this redoubling of abstraction, and how those might be interesting places to explore. Aren't those places where fantasy comes up, whether it's the fantasy of people engaging in a system or fantasies about the system and explanation? Aren't these gaps kind of places where real fantasy, both as a behavior and then as actual kind of like conceptual objects, come in, and therefore like questions around ideology? And if not here, JP, are there other places in this kind of like constellation of thinkers that you think the questions of fantasy and, you know, the whole kind of classic questions of ideology critique, but especially where like I've been getting more and more into the question of like the actual process of sitting around or at work or whatever, like the actual cognitive moments of fantasizing and how those sustain day in and day out the actual fantasy. So I'm kind of wondering in all this where that might kind of play.
Yeah, I'm not sure about fantasy. This is not something really that I thought too much about. I was more engaged in the, let us say, the political epistemology of this, and of course the influence of economics into the epistemology, right? So what was kind of interesting to me is the fact that from the Solarian point of view, you might get something like ideology or fantasy, but it is not thought of as a fantasy. Like, for instance, there's this difference between the manifest image and the scientific image in Sellars, which are simplifications, really. What Sellars is gesturing at is not that you have like a piecemeal scientific theory, but that those scientific theories that you might have historically at a certain point, they condense upon a certain image or self-image of man or humanity, and what does it mean to be human and all that. In Sellars, this is destined to be refuted. So in a certain sense, you have like ideology in a certain sense there, but ideology, if you want to juxtapose the idea of ideology there, ideology has also, which of course in a certain set of Marxist thinkers, it also has a kind of right to being a kind of knowledge claim as well. It's not pure, deception. Like I remember, for instance, Jameson saying that ideology is the place where you can map the relationship between the individual and the social whole. So there's a kind of knowledge claim to be had within this fantasy, within this ideology. So it's not fantasy or ideology in the sense of being wrong or being something like that. Yeah, I'm trying to improvise like an answer to you. Like, it's not really something that I thought too much about, but I think the idea of having like not only a history of science in the Salesian sense, but a history of science that impinges upon the self-conception of the one that is making the science, like the way we are thinking of ourselves within the theories themselves that we are coming up with, is an interesting place to maybe compare, I wouldn't say juxtapose or anything like that, or maybe compare or locate something like a concept of ideology at place. But within the Salesian approach, you're always in the process of knowledge, but it is thought of in the Peircean sense as asymptotic approximation to final science, which we will never get. But anyway, this is the tendency. Yeah, and then what? Sorry.
Perhaps there's actually some. Sorry, there is another question. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know who that is.
Hi. I'll try to turn on the video, but I don't know how I look right now. I'm very tired.
Ah,
Oh.
Don't worry, don't worry.
hey, Lika.
Oh,
How are
hello.
you? Yeah.
Yeah, probably I needed to react earlier because my impressions, they mostly concern the Salarzian things and the parts about games. But when I listened to Gabriel, I thought that Gabriel's reasoning, his attack on Giannotti, yes, that's his name, it is, I have an impression that it may be not relevant because from what I got, what JP explained about games is really doesn't have this concept of money as an abstraction that is a fixed point related to money as a universal equivalence. Why? Because in the example of games, for instance, there was a very interesting part about how the game goes, that there are some rules of the game is played. After the game is finished, the rules are renegotiated and they are renegotiated in a way that they are now presupposed again based on the process of the game. Yes, that's how I saw, that's how I understood this thing about reenacting of operational organizational scheme.
Yeah.
So there are two, yes, and in the operational scheme there are some categories that are rules that are being redefined after the game is played. So it seems that there are basically two sets of rules. One set of rules that is before the game, the second set of rules that is after the game. And what is the first set of rules if we want to criticize the foundations, if we want to criticize normative constitutions and ask where do they come from? I think they do not come from the outside, from the capital perspective. They come as these normative constitutions. The first set of rules comes from our theories, or just the first set of rules is postulated by us just to make the game playable. So the first set of rules is just a condition for the game elements use.
Can I answer, Lika? Can I answer a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. No, do you want to finish, or you have some other question? Sorry. No. Yeah.
No, I was.
Okay.
I got this impression from the analogy of the myth of Jones. If you want to know from where I was going.
From whom? Sorry.
From the Ryland myth
the myth
of
of Jones. Yeah, myth of Jones.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
No. I think yeah. I was going to use your question to make a distinction that is kind of important. I like the way you're saying that the rules are something that is our theory of what we are doing in a certain sense. I like that. But I like that as the epistemological descriptive side of things. Like, of course, we have to come up with candidates of rules to, for instance, come up with a description of something. Of course, you were talking about games. Of course, there is the example of a ball game. I take it that you mean that, right? But I think Giannotti is not gesturing toward games here. He's saying something much more broad, like any kind of interrelation between so-called agents whereby they get enmeshed within, I mean, it's not something very voluntary, you see. It's something that they get enmeshed and specified by the fact that they are participating in a social form. I think this is the point that Giannotti is making. So it's not something that, for Giannotti specifically, he doesn't want to have fully constituted individuals as, you know, as the stuff that is constituting the operational scheme. It's the operational scheme itself that is constituting the agents. So this is why Gabriel was talking about the function of money. You may shift the centrality, you see, of the determining element of the operational scheme from, for instance, the ball, and see the ball game. The centrality is not the players, is the ball. So the ball is you know the measuring thing in the ball game. It's not the players. So, and the ball game that Giannotti is talking about, it doesn't have really rules. It's just somebody, you know, throwing a ball to each other and specifying therefore their strength, the relationship between their strength and the weight of the ball and the resistance of the air, and you name it. So a lot of things, a lot of different measures get enmeshed in the constitution of that operational scheme. And this is of course, this is a theoretical framework that he uses to make sense of other kinds of social formations, including, I mean, in this book, the most important one, capitalist social formations, the production process, the labor process, and the relationship between value and this and value, sorry. And yeah, so I think yeah, I'm just specifying what I meant with that. I mean, the rules, the specific rules of the ball game are not fixed either for Giannotti. They are being constituted by the fact that agents are enmeshed within this circuit, you see. So you're kind of, in your question, I think you're reversing kind of the order of explanation here. And if you want to talk Salarzian, you have to say that it is not rule governed, it is pattern governed. So if you want to talk Salarzian, this is pattern governed activity. And pattern governed activity can be present in a completely unconscious way. And it is ubiquitous for Salars. Rule governed activity is parasitic upon pattern governed in a certain sense. So, and this brings me to the first part of your question, whether the reposition, the presupposition and position, right? The dialectics between position and the presupposition entail the modification of rules. No, in Giannotti's sense, it doesn't entail the modification of rules. Of course, if a certain pattern is objectified as rule governed, you may change rules. You may say, why don't we do it like this instead of that? And this is always possible when the pattern is objectified as a rule. But that was not the point of Giannotti's example. Giannotti's example was just to make plausible the idea of a social form that is active, that is going on, even though we don't want to play the game. This is the thing. We don't really consciously want to play the game as the game that it is, objectified. We are just enmeshed in a social objectivity that makes us move in a certain way. So this was the point of Giannotti's framework. Of course, it has like this interesting passage with Wittgenstein and Sellers and all this philosophy of language. I don't think he would come up with a model like this without that, but this was the point, actually. It's not really rule governed, it's more pattern governed, if you want to talk Salarzian.
Yeah. Yes, maybe I mixed word rules, the meaning of word rules, and the meaning of phrase categorical scheme that is redefined.
Okay.
Maybe. But actually, I didn't mean that there are individuals in the first place. I didn't mean it either, because yes, what I thought about is the myth of Jones, where the okay, no, I wouldn't explain this analogy, but what I thought that yes, in the first place we have some practice in which we are involved. Our interactions, our existence in this practice, it's at some point may lead us to the necessity of expanding this practice. And at this point, maybe we will postulate the existence of abstract entities, such as thoughts.
Okay, I see what's the relationship. Yeah.
So
yeah,
that is the first interaction. After that, after this postulation, we'll arrive at this set of rules 2, this set of rules, set of rules 1, and this set of rules 1 is just a postulation that enables our practice to go on or to expand. So the practice, so yes, the individual was something that is not concrete, but has an emergence in a practice.
Yeah, but you see, I mean, this framework of postulating the rules in order to go on, it's a very theoretical point of view, right? Like this is a kind of a limit to sellers in a certain sense. That comes from Carnap, comes from certain other influences. Carnap was only able to think of, almost in natural language in terms of artificial language all the time. Like it has to postulate a certain kind of syntax, and then you have to presuppose a certain domain of objects that is have a relationship to that, to the signals that compose the syntax. You see, this itself is an abstract way of proceeding. Like it's the theory construction or language construction. It's okay as theory construction or language construction. It's completely okay. It's not a problem. But as a general explanation of behavior, it presupposes a place where you could just postulate out what's going on around you. You see. And for instance, if you go to the infrastructure of what Sellers is doing, my point of view is that there is this Wittgensteinian influence there, and Wittgenstein is fundamentally different from that. Like the point of view of practice is prioritary there. So there's a primacy of practice, and therefore you don't explain language from a point of view where you are the master of the means of semantic production. You see, you're not a master.
But I cannot.
You're not a proprietor of the means of semantic production. Yeah.
I don't postulate whatsoever. I think there is not this case that I can postulate whatsoever. I can postulate only something that is related to my practical goal.
Yeah. This is a tool. This is tool use. It's almost like an extension of tool use, right? Like my point of view is that we are like laborers of the semantic means of production. We are not the proprietors of the semantic means of production.
Why?
Because we are always already enmeshed in the operational schemes. And of course, we discuss this a lot, the idea of life forming in the courses and stuff like that. But I think this only happens with a certain very special caveats, and you have to think the possibility of redefining the framework within the limits that the linguistic symbolic redefinition is able to do. This is not the same as materially changing the operational scheme. You see, of course, it can orient action in a certain way. So there's a very fine-grained, I think, mediation that is going on there in order to, think of a rule change as being a relevant way of changing, the operational schemes themselves, in a certain sense. So Gabriel wants to comment upon something.
Yeah, no, just because if I understood correctly, Lika, your point was that there is no fixed point because this reevaluation of rules is going to change from time to time. So there is no sense of saying that this, starting from this minimal assumptions of a practice we are embedded in, that we're following some provisory protocol. We're going to change it afterwards. So we don't need to presuppose any fixed points. And that would be the basis of your remark, if I understood correctly, that one thing doesn't require the other, right?
Maybe when I was commenting the first time, yes, but then I understood that it is not correct to think so. Yes, the first set of rules should be oriented towards practice.
Because what I thought is that we can connect this discussion you guys are having with John's question, and I think invert things a bit. We've read recently Liliana Siketcha's text on class and normativity, and one of the things she tries to push forward against Althusser and against other thinkers is that it's very hard to organize anything and to take anything seriously in politics if you assume that workers are not concerned with their own well-being, and if they speak and act and choose certain concepts, they're not doing this because it leads them closer to their practical goals. So she tries to use this kind of E.P. Thompson, what they call practical theoretical approach of Hayao Miyagi as well, to say, look, it's not that useful to just talk about ideology, fantasy, manipulation, and the sort of extrinsic aspect of class formation, because class society is actually formed by people trying to solve specific problems, and the added aggregate effect is class domination. But you cannot just top down presuppose class domination and try to derive everything from it. So I think that there is actually a very interesting thing to add to the whole issue of fantasy or ideology, which is that it's an added condition to take seriously that, let's say we define for a second fantasy or ideology in the sense that guys like Zizek or Jameson use, to say something like additional concepts that don't have any direct reference in your practice, but they are localizing that practice in a larger social cohesion. So they are kind of in between concepts. You will say things like, I'll do this, I'll do that, this will lead me to my practical goal, and then you add some addition, like, because this also makes the world a better place. Like, it just connects you to other people with no direct reference, right? For example, give some determination to that indeterminate other, more than just extract a certain shared norms from it, something like that. So just, let's say, kind of reducible to something within the use of concepts. The cool thing about thinking in those terms is that those concepts which are kind of fantasized, or they have some level of kind of, seems like they're stitching up something, they nevertheless need to keep the pragmatic game running. So I think it's a nice addition to the theory of, ideology as something phantasmatic or whatever. That fine, there might be some crazy fiction going on. That doesn't mean it need to work for certain practical goals, right? So I think that's really cool to develop in that direction. But then what I think, I just realized this, I never stopped to think about this, but after Lilian's text and the discussion, I think it's much clearer. A very funny thing to think about is that I don't think there is no human economic gain, because every time you actually use money, the way you practically justify is surviving. You work to survive, you use money to survive. So it's always coupled with real justifications that concern social reproduction of humans. The pure language game of capital does not concern the social reproduction of humans. It concerns the self-valorization of money, right? So it's kind of almost like it's a part of every kind of rational game, but never the whole of it. everyone is saying, I'll need to use this in a certain way in order to achieve a practical goal, which is surviving, or organizing with other workers, or competing in the labor market, or buying the cheapest thing because I need to survive. None of these spells out the basic normative principles through which money self-valorizes in the hand of capital, and then you will get it. Nobody actually, in simple circulation, which is what still we work in, like I use my money to buy things to eat, right? Mm-hmm. From the point of view of simple circulation, you have a bunch of kind of uses, categorical kind of structures, which are always mixed with the social reproduction of people. You won't understand the goal of people doing anything, right? And you will probably have a very fetishized idea of ideology, as if people are manipulated and repeating some things, not because it's the easiest way to get what they need to survive, right? But then there's this inverse view, which I think is where that bifurcation I meant, for two ways of accounting for the paths of real abstraction, right? It comes in because if you want to spell out the game or the logic that capital is going through as it decides, some capitalist needs to decide that it's better to put the factory in the indigenous land because it's cheaper than to put somewhere else. You can't even justify that it's self-reproduction of that person, because that person is also going to die when the planet dissolves. Mm-hmm. So you can't really assume that the thing that's going to survive to revise its strategies, continue, it's people, right? So you can actually have a nice definition where, you know, the games of giving and asking reasons for social lives, it's literally forms of life in the sense that we need to survive the games we play, right? Whereas from the standpoint of capitalist reproduction, that's not necessarily a part of the goal, and it might actually survive as a sort of kind of shift thing that only appears once you glue together all these games, parses out all the social reproduction of human life from it, then you get something like the string that connects economic behavior regardless of people, you know? So I think that there is a nice kind of class struggle, of normative class struggle you could have there, you know? Because of precisely, you know, thinking of practices in terms of problem solving, like problem solvents of humans have to do with, you know, staying here to solve other problems, whereas problem solving of capital, it's weirdly devoid of that obstacle, right? So there's something there probably we could explore some more, I think. But one question that I have the impression that when things get mixed in this particular way, you guys are clearly much more versed in this than I am. I'm not sure if this is a necessity or just an impression, but I have the impression that when we try to explain the process of learning a game or learning a set of rules or behaviors, exactly as the same as the genesis of that rule, that we create a double, like a too heavy a weight to solve everything at the same time. Like Marx had a name for this. He called Robinsonates, a classical economist that said, like, let's start in an island with two people. They spontaneously develop money relations. And Marx was like, why would you start there? Like with the genesis of trade. Trade has like 5,000 years of history. Capital has 300. A bunch of things are presupposed, cognitive ability, so on. And none of those things were enough to account for the birth of commodity producing society. So fine to try to go towards the genesis, but, you know, for example, it's possible to think in terms of, you know, nomadic societies develop certain tools and certain ways of exchanging and talking and dealing with concepts, so on. Later on, all these tools and resources we have are totally repurposed by something that was born in a totally random way in the interaction between empires and, you know, trading their materials. And then those two things get caught up in the future.
Yeah. Can I interrupt?
Of course.
It's just, I think, yes, in the Soviet Marxist dialectics, that's what they told basically in a very, very simplified way, that the history of capitalism is the history of humanity, and talking about the origins again. But Sellers, I think he realizes that, and he realizes that a lot of philosophers, they end up in this pit of reasoning about origins, and that is why he comes up with this imaginary, not an explanatory, but just a fictional story of origin, just in order for us to not to think of the origin again. He just needs it to, I think he needs it ultimately to reinstantiate the human agency at the very beginning. So yeah, in order for us not to think that some external force is what is driving us in the first place. And about the game, yes, my account of the game was really idealistic, and if it was really working in a real world, that would mean that the account of money would change always.
But I think it does. I think you're right. No, but I think you're right. Like, I have a lot of patients who start using money as, just a means of exchange. And with time, they start accumulating a bit of money because they're doing a bit well off. And it changes the meaning. And now they want to keep the money and not spend it. So I think
but as you said, what is changing there are forms of life, but not the basic capitalist structure.
Yeah, those two things need to be compatible. Like, exactly. We need to be able to say, obviously, from a pragmatic point of view, the person was thinking one way, they tried some things don't work or work better than another way, they're trying a new way, updating their priors and so on. And somehow we should be able to also say that from a different perspective, nothing changed. Like, that's a really nice way of putting a normative problem of social reproduction, right? Weirdly, money reproduces itself through our own reproduction. But those two things are still separate projects somehow, some separate process, right? One thing, just to, before John interacts, one thing that I really wanted to hear your thoughts, Karon, because I have the impression that this also might be useful for like Szilárd in reaccount of Sonretto. One thing that I find very interesting to kind of confront Sonretto with is that I think he has a hypothesis he's never very explicit about, which is, it's a very common theme in Marxists. He didn't invent this idea that social being determines social consciousness. And that, you want to understand the science of some time, look at, slave relations, you will understand Aristotle. But that doesn't explain why Aristotle is still useful after Aristotle's time. That it doesn't explain. So one thing is to say that ideations are determined by the social condition. And I think you can account for that in a more pragmatic sense, where if a society is organized in this way, the more fine-tuned I am to what is effective and relevant, the more success I will have, perhaps. But weirdly enough, you can come up with abstractions like mathematical abstractions. They can take a life of their own.
Yeah.
And they no longer have anything to do with capitalism.
Yeah.
Right. And Sonretto actually took that view against other Marxists who thought
true.
that he meant, right, that so therefore we need to abolish machinery, science. And he was like, no.
Not at all.
Saying the opposite of this.
It's the opposite.
So,
like the emancipatory vector was, he thought of production logic, not a circulation logic, like Taylorism, that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I wonder if this doesn't give, this doesn't even help us conciliate these two views, because the thing you're looking for, fine, abstractions appear, but that doesn't mean that the logic of implication between abstractions also appears.
Yeah, I agree.
But what if that remaining indeterminate is precisely what allows science to be not capitalistic? Because the rules of what you do with oneness, what you do with lack of time and space is underdetermined. So it might get caught up in a theological debate about the nature of God, which it did, and turn out into modern science, which now has nothing to do with capital or commodity, right? So it might even be useful to explain science and to explain, let's say, how we enter into the Szilárd point of view to benefit from that indetermination, right? Yeah. Rather than simply substituting it. It might actually help to show that, fine, we can give, let's say, a logical genesis, but the logic of genesis of some sort of punctum is not the logic of the genesis of the implicative structures it will fall into.
Yeah, you're right. And I think this is my main issue with crude forms of, derivation from the material basis that I see sometimes. Like, this is only the material basis expressing itself as, superstructure. I always have that in mind. Like, but the thing is, has a kind of autonomy that you can do stuff that is not only, caught within the the necessities put forward by the material basis, or the compensatory fantasies that the material bases are calling for, but the thing has autonomy, so it ends up having autonomy. It might even come up that way, I agree, but it ends up having autonomy, like he has like an autonomous kind of development. So yeah, I agree.
So I wonder if we don't need like actually a tripartite structure to account for, like you could account, let's say, if you accept basics on Repto's kind of structure, which I think is interesting because in anthropology, there's actually a very nice way of spelling out what this means concretely with, for example, ideas of silent trade and like this very early commodity exchanges that didn't imply like full commerce development, like in the Greek world. Like he has a bit of an Eurocent, like a Greek Western centrism there. It's not necessary. But whatever, you have this idea that, okay, real abstraction in economic exchange exists. And then you should be able to open 3 routes. Like what sort of kind of protocols people develop as actors in that exchange. So there's, let's say, the normative game, the ordinary normative structure going on for people to continue to exchange, which certainly doesn't include Kant's categories. Like you don't need to be a Kantian to exchange, right?
Yeah.
Somehow things that are now implied in that process, they can be taken up by philosophy and science, which take them totally out of the social historical development into new territories that don't need to preserve anything of that origin, as you were saying, right?
Yeah.
And a third thing which seems to be possible is that somehow, I'm not sure if it falls as what you call pattern governed behavior or rule governed, but somehow there's something about these social dynamics that is more legible if the linguistic form doesn't put the human agent in the position of, the players, but the commodities themselves. Like these 3 things need to be able to exist together, right? Abstraction giving rise to real scientific thought. Seller seems to be interested in that. That's different from, let's say, the manifested image of economic trade, which is what people are engaged with. I need to survive, which is social reproduction. But that's also not the same as the fact that this weird inversion remains possible. At some point, it becomes more intelligible to say the market wants this or that than to say people want this or that, So somehow I think that we can actually conciliate all those different directions.
Yeah. I was parsing out this in the difference between rule governed and pattern governed. Yeah, I have to think a little bit more because I don't know the full consequences of that. But yeah, I'm on board. John wanted to ask something. I mean, who's leaving?
Yasha.
Oh, Yasha. Okay.
But I think John went to the bathroom real quick.
Okay.
He's back.
John wanted to comment.
Oh, sure. It's just more response stuff. I noticed Raphael raised his hand, so if there's anyone that's got their own stuff to bring up. Well, I guess I've found like this framework really interesting, JP, because, and in relationship to the question of fantasy, because I am like really concerned from the perspective precisely of the capacity for people to problem solve so effectively in certain domains that have such fantasies in others, and really where those kind of like points of reference turn on and off, which incidentally, I think you said at one point you're interested in Girard, and I find like Girard's exponential is really interesting as an idea about how that works. But I find like this idea of like the justificatory relation and the kind of like way that these implicative chains kind of open up in that transition from sentience to sapience. And I'm wondering within the framework, like what are the practical kind of things that, like, especially looking at from like the means of abstraction, the technological means of abstraction, like what is the kind of tangible process of taking that step? You know, like what is, like the example you gave around red, like a parrot can say X is red, but I say like X is red because it's not blue.
Yeah, you exemplify that in your behavior. Like it's legible. Like it's legible that you understand the consequences of something being red. You treat you treat things as they are colored. You use concepts as they are colored. You can discuss, I don't know, the color of a sample patch of, you know, wallpaper, whatever, you see.
So would it be fair to connect that to like the ball game in the sense that like when I give a justification, someone else kind of picks it up and says, yeah, that makes sense. Like
yeah, of course. Language is socialized in that framework. Yeah, absolutely.
So then in a sense, like if we look at fantasy as like a collective practice, like I'm thinking about, like to respond to some of Gabriel's points, like when I worked at Comcast, my like I was a cable tech in the van, blah, blah, blah. And like we could tell very easily when corporate was giving us the kind of top down, like that, like we would joke about it. Like I'm not kind of concerned with that. My question is more like how the way the workers themselves would collectively maintain certain kind of fantasies. And like I'm really interested in that precisely because, you know, like we went in this mentorship program, right? And I was being taught the practical how-tos to solve, like, you know, which includes not just like turn the dial this way, but real abstract processes of reasoning. And you run up against, for example, like one place where like a technician will identify a fantasy within the context of problem solving are all the jokes they make about engineers, right? Like an engineer will design this ideal schema and then a tech will actually have to implement it. And so for the tech, the engineer's very problem solving has something phantasmatic about it. It's already a fantasy to believe it's going to work. But the fantasy is not separate from the problem solving apparatus. The fantasy comes out precisely in the kind of differential levels of the abstraction of intellectual labor and manual labor and blah, blah, blah.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
But there is still something phantasmatic, and it would cut the other way too, because I remember this really weird moment. This guy had come from a factory that had been closed by the who are those right-wing brothers? Like
the Koch brothers.
Yeah, they bought up their factory the moment they unionized, sold it off, and this guy came to Comcast, which is an infamously anti-union store, like never works in any Comcast outfit. And he turned to me when I told him I got the job, and he said, "Well, don't worry. Now that you're here, you don't have a job; you have a career." And like there was this strange moment of like all the stuff that's like been talked about by Zizek and stuff, and I don't want to emphasize the manipulation. What I'm really interested in is like that moment when he said that to me, like that moment of like passing this kind of token, like you're talking about, JP, of like now you can condense everything down to this identification of having a career here in this and like this idea. And there's something very, you know, real there, because those like that same process of exchanging these kind of like phantasmatic tokens is the exact same process where I learned how to problem solve a failed internet line. You know, like it was the same conversations, the same showdowns, and certain times it seemed to like even phase into the actual explanation itself in a weird kind of way. So
John,
yeah,
did you
sorry,
read that text?
Like, I'm going way off, but yeah, that's kind of why I find it really interesting and kind of where it becomes a relevant problem, like in workplaces, not in like a academic kind of like I want to show everyone how they're being used in a way, you know.
But dude, have you read the text? I think we circulated a bit. We didn't really discuss it yet, though. I think now we probably should. It's a simulation done by social scientist. This woman, she tries to give a formal backing to the claim that marginalized people tend to have more knowledge about a situation than people who are not marginalized. And she just creates a network where people connect and update their beliefs as they go along, right? but she adds a cost measure to updating. And for example, when somebody says something stupid to you, like, just apply this thing here, and you know it's going to take a lot of work to do it. Why do you do it? Because you don't want to lose your job. So the cost of dismantling the illusion trickles down to you, right? When the guy says, you have a career here, what's happening is, you know he's full of shit. He might not even know he's full of shit, because everything confirms for him that there's actually career, because nobody complains when he says it. You need to pay the price for knowing he's wrong, not saying it, actually, working with that illusion so that you actually stay there. And what I love about this paper is that she actually shows that this is a tendency of networks that update, where agents are updating their priors. If you are removed from a group, the fact you lack certain consensus that the dominant group has implies that you cannot afford not to update. You cannot afford not to revise your priors and remain more connected. But at the same time, you cannot afford to share that information with people who are above you, right? So the tendency is that there is actually, let's say, a formal proof for a standpoint epistemology, that there are positions where you can see the world better than others. It actually goes in that direction, and I think
that's interesting.
This idea very well, like, right? But I mean, I would say that what Zizek calls ideology is probably the logic of these illusions taken as themselves, let's say, spirit moving, because whether you want it or not, because it was more costly to you, and nobody's doing it for the other guy. The fact is that the illusion continues to go on. You couldn't say anything, right? You had to just be quiet. You could only talk with your peers about it in the absence of that guy. And in doing so, the illusion continues, right? That's exactly the theory of the law includes its own transgression, which is Zizek's basic theory of ideology, right? Why is it that the transgression is not transgressive? Because you need to both enact it. You need to both know that the career concept is not true, and you cannot do anything about it, because the cost of doing something about it individually is infinite, right? You will just lose your job and get fucked. So we can actually conciliate all that into a nice little communist theory. We can all be friends. I like that. Let me find that text. I know it's online somewhere.
I think Eduardo wants to comment something.
Hi, I have a couple of short questions. The first one, I was thinking, I don't know if it's the part 1 or 2, he's like drawing the conclusions from understanding value in mathematics and value in physics and how does it relate to language. He differentiates between the two, but like the difference, I don't think I kind of grasp what is the essential difference between these two processes. I think it's when he's talking about weight. And also, it's kind of, he talks about artificial language and natural language. What is like this sort of distinction that he's making? It would be natural language tied to logic, or what he calls like practical logos. And how can we understand this practical logos? Is like this sort of imbrication of the social forms, it's exactly this, or something a little bit different. And finally, I'm kind of confused by his use of Skinner, because at the beginning of the part 4 of this chapter, he says something like, we saw how the definition of generalized reforce implicates a species of interiorization of the universal at the level of their own reality, as the generality of consequences of the act that constitutes a given that the own organism needs to take into account. Since he's using Skinner, he said he's not affectionate to the source, but how this differentiates from Zizek's own use of Lacan to approximate Marx, and because it's not the same sort of framing, but the idea of this internalization of a universal seems very close of what Zizek works through with his comparison of Lacan and Marx.
Okay, 3 questions, right? Like the first one was math and physics. The second one was artificial and natural language. The third one was Skinner and Lacan. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, from what I remember, I mean, I think the second question is a good way to gives us a good thread to answer the first one. Not sure the third one, but the first one for sure. The difference he says between artificial and natural language, if I remember correctly, is he's always putting in question the idea that you have, you know, a given set of objects before you make any operations with them. For instance, when he comments on math, it seems to be Zermelo Fraenkel, like ZFC, like stuff that Badiou uses a lot, and we used a lot here in the STP. For instance, he says something like, to have like a fixed given set of objects prevents paradox emerging and stuff like that. But what he's interested in is in the constitution of these objects. Like this is the problem. I'm not sure. I can't really say that he achieves what he wants, but he goes a long way into trying to give an account of a certain kind of process that is, I would say, similar to the logic of essence in Hegelian logic. If you want to go that to read that, like the logic of presupposition and position and the ground in English, ground. Yeah. So he's trying to give an account of the constitution of these different objects. So natural language, the problem with natural language, for instance, when he says, for instance, he uses Frege as example, the morning star and the night and the evening star, he says like, yeah, you can identify the two and say, okay, there's a reference to the expression, the morning star, which is the same as the reference for the expression, the evening star. But the point is, this is a concretion after a process, a whole process of observations and painstaking testing and all of that in order to make an identification. So that point is not just a localized point about, you know, scientific endeavors, but a point of about the constitution of meanings in a certain sense. So I think actually he can't really do it for the math, I would say, and this is why he goes on to physics, and he says like physics has to use like material supports in order to individualize the magnitudes and the concepts that physics is using. So this is kind of the thing about measure that is important to him. I don't really remember how he goes on with a math example. I'd say a good way to parse that out would be to oppose maybe the category theoretical way of doing it and the set theoretical way. Like this is what Badiou says in Mathematics of the Transcendental. Like it could like almost map into what Giannotti wants. Like he wants to have as primitive actions, not, you know, a constituted object in a certain sense. So for me, it seems like he's on the side of the category theoretical account. If you want to look for the mathematical infrastructure that might be what he's looking for when he criticizes a theory on that account. And natural language, therefore, is obliged to do that. It's obliged to, you know, to walk the walk, so to speak, instead of considering it as like a constituted path. And this is the difference with artificial language. The stuff about Skinner, I don't really know too much about the relationship, possible relationship between reinforcements in behaviorism and Lacanian psychoanalysis to comment really. Maybe Gabriel has something to say about that comparison. I don't feel I'm competent to to answer that question specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's trying to do something that is not part of Lacanian theory. Lacan has a hard time explaining. I mean, he's good with the logic of the signifier and subject and so on, but why this signifier rather than that? Why this sticks rather than that? Usually, you know, Lacan doesn't. It's not good with regional symbolic structures. He's good with really big universal constitutive ones. So if you say, fine, logic of the signifier, but why here in this way and that there in that way, that it doesn't have much to say about that. We could go into that discussion, I think, but I think part of what makes Lacan and Hegel, Zizekian Marxism, something that is hard to let go fully of, which I think is something that he tries to keep alive, even if everything else starts looking inconsistent, is that for Zizek, the thing that Lika said about, I think we first have a practice, then abstractions kind of appear as we postulate them and so on. Like Zizek just want to make sure that you give enough autonomy to ideations and the logic of these abstract relations, that it makes sense to keep the full Hegelian theory of spirit, which is decoupled from agents to the point that it's not even just the distributed rationality. It's even more autonomous than that. Like there's something for him in this autonomy, this extreme autonomy of spirit, which is something he wants to keep. And Lacan has enough new concepts to help give a logical description of why that is the case, the idea of the other, blah, 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 blah. So I think that that's like his contribution to most of these things, is to, let's say, not simply have an asymptotic idea that abstractions, it's okay to believe that they are kind of real or kind of autonomous. He wants to have some level in which, he still have a contemporary form of absolute idealism, right? So he thinks that's still relevant. So you can think of what you want from that, but that I think it's what makes him like singular. One thing I just wanted, I don't need to go into it, but probably I missed this in the book because I have the impression Giannotti could not skip this. But like in chapter 1 in Capital, when Marx uses Giannotti is very tricky. He's clearly quoting the first chapter with the heavy comparison of scales and weight of objects. But he doesn't say it until later, when lo and behold, from it you generalize to something more akin labor and value. Yeah. But in Capital, this is how it's actually written. Look at it. I can't share it, but if you look at it here.
Yeah, I can make you. I don't know.
Would you mind, just so I can show you something?
Yeah, go
on. I feel like this is the trick he's trying to silently conclude, and with a hypothesis of his own. This is Marx talking about, the bodily form has value, and then he says, let's illustrate this point about the measure applied to commodities. And then he goes, sugar loaves being a body is heavy, blah, 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 blah. And then here he says this, here's where the analogy ceases, meaning you cannot continue and generalize from the weight relation to the value relation. For Marx, you cannot make that step. But Giannotti does make that step. He thinks that there's something at stake here, which is the key to understanding what happens here after the analogy has ceased. Right? I feel like he's almost saying, the analogy ceased because now it's the same. It's not the analogy ceased because now it's different. But that's like Giannotti's very particular addition there, right? And I feel like that's also a very good point to show where the two, that bifurcation, kind of happens here. If you say, well, but in some sense, for agents, the analogy does not cease. It's not true that it ceases. Then you get the operational schema. If you say, no, but in the sense that social form is not the same as collective form, it's not the same as communal form, it's not the same as group form, it's not either agreement, shared norms, it's just something, right? At that point, then you would have like money, form, structure, and something else that doesn't concern humans anymore. It concerns this social dynamic in which we're more objects than agents, right? So, but I find this to be the very sentence that we need to kind of negotiate with to, both reconstitute the continuity Giannotti is trying to do, and also make it conciliate it with this apparently disconjuncted point of view. I think it's very nice that exactly the point that Marx makes is, Here I cannot continue with the analogy. And Giannotti says, fuck it. Yes, you can.
Yeah. So he brings in agents and people and, you know, operation scheme. Yeah, I see. Yeah.
So it's interesting to see that, I think.
Yeah, that's crucial, I'd say. Like, there's a lot in there in that difference. Yeah.
Maybe Giannotti is refuting the third value forms, the idea.
No, he's
of
not.
form.
He's not. Believe me.
Yeah,
he's not.
if he were, I think, yeah, he would. It would be
He's
against his own will.
He's a value form theorist. In this book, he's like, it is a book
but
about
there are
value form
four
theory.
types. There are four types of values.
Yeah, well,
No?
yeah.
And
there are different accounts of value form. Like, yeah, like this is, yeah, it's just like how to say that, exuberant. Value form theory is like exuberant kind of thing. I'm diving into this stuff like for 1.5 years now, and it's kind of, but yeah, but it is about value form theory book, really. I mean, if you want to say that it is one thing, it is a value form theory book. Trabalho, Reflexão.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
But I do think that, I think that there are nice kind of indications in the way you presented things and all this discussion of, you know, a kind of, rather than a sort of reductive program where you should be able to reduce one thing to the other, for example, to fully account for, you know, capitalist categories from the pragmatic point of view, there is a different condition, which is a sort of, I think a strong version would be an equivalence condition, meaning if we fully were to describe all the operational protocols for behavior of society as a whole, we would have already described capitalist logic, even though reproducing capital and self-realizing won't be either the goal nor the collected goal of all of those processes. But in some sense, to do one thing is to already have done the other, right? That would be, let's say, one version, and the other would be to say, like, if you want to stitch together all these protocols that have humans as agents, you need to include one game which doesn't, right? So either it's an equivalence in the sense that the capital down description and the workers up description, they need to be equivalent. So if I fully describe from the bottom, I've already described the top, or they are kind of laterally coherent in the sense that I need to add a fake game or a fake protocol because it doesn't have human agents counting as agents. It has them counting as objects called labor power that is shuffled around with other stuff.
And this
for the sake of an
and this maps onto Arantes' critique of Giannotti in a certain sense, like the capital down.
Yeah, I think it maps,
up.
but it makes it like, it shows that it's not an intractable problem.
Yeah, that's my impression. That's my intuition. It's not intractable. I think he's naming perhaps one problem more than he's saying this guy is completely wrong. Like throw it in the garbage can. I don't think he's saying that actually. I like his locating a possible problem. I mean, problem in the sense of an interesting problem, of a problem to be worked on.
Yeah, I think it's totally tractable. And I think it maps very nicely with the discussion we were having of Lillian's text, and that Miriam said she's going to present on this kind of practical theoretical research project of Yaegi and these other guys, because, you know, like we've been working with this idea that there is an equivalence between how things are composed, how things interact, and what is intelligible. Like these three things should reinforce each other and sometimes even be treated as just redescriptions of the same thing. So the process through which things become intelligible, the process through which things interact, and the process through which things get composed to make other things. These three things are just kind of indissociable if you take this organizational point of view. And I feel like Giannotti's language, it's privileging the interaction intelligibility axis, right? Whereas, for example, sometimes it looks like Paulo Arantes' critique is that, well, but the composition of capital, organic composition, those things, they can't really be reduced by that. So probably there's just a way of kind of rephrasing interaction and intelligibility in such a way that it's okay if, for example, there are games where we are not acting in order to make things intelligible for us, but we are acting in order to make things intelligible for money. Like that's a difference, right? So for example, when I go to sell something I made in the streets for people to buy, I'm not worried about making it intelligible for me what the price of what I'm doing is. I might have totally, like I spend the whole night awake and I'm selling something my grandmother gave me. Like for me, it's really costly to be doing what I'm doing, right? But I'm worried about giving the price, making the price intelligible for others, because it's their rationale of if it's worth buying or not that is gonna make me not starve. So it's weirdly that it's part of the game to act as if I'm not an agent in the game, right? Something like this. So I think it's possible to add this sort of caveat to some rational structures where it's rational to act as if the rational actor is someone else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, that could help like start thinking how to ultimately compose these things together. Like you don't compose the perspective of the buyer and the seller by considering as the meeting of two agents. You can recognize the asymmetry that's there, which for Marx is the basic asymmetry in the value form between buyer and seller, as the asymmetry between somebody who's playing the game as if they are the agent and somebody who's playing the game as if the other is the agent, right? And that's what gives them, reinforces them as, okay, this makes sense. If I played as if I'm the agent when I'm selling you something, it wouldn't work. You tell me like, this is it costs 10. I say, no, it doesn't. You know, I need more. And then I wouldn't get anything. So next time you say it costs 10, I will say, yes, sir, it does, right? So perhaps there is a way to start compatibilizing these things and introducing from the get-go this option, you know, from the ground up.
But Gabriel, are you saying that those rational explanations that they just how it goes, or that they this is how it should the social interactions should exist? Do you?
Sorry, explain a bit better. I think I got lost.
Yeah.
What will be the difference?
Yes, it's my big question to Marxists. I think that I should postpone it to the other discussion.
You should just do a presentation here. I mean, the big question, that would be the best title for a discussion here. The big question to Marxists. That would be amazing.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know how to navigate any of this. Like now I'm definitely more confused than in the beginning, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah, I think I have to go home.
Yeah, okay, let's stop it here. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this was great. For me, at least, I liked.
No, it was amazing,
and it was excellent.
Discussion.
It puts a lot of things together.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be unfolded after this. I think a lot of things appeared. So yeah, it's promising.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See you all. Thank you so much, Caron. It was really amazing.
Thank you.
See you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I think your host, you can finish up. Yeah, because it,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you recorded, right?
Yeah, recording. Yeah,
Okay.
it will automatically.
Okay.
Yeah.